Bloodborne is a game where every single weapon tells a story, and today I've gone through all 256 lore details, Easter eggs, and hidden connections across every weapon in the game, so you can finally have them all in one place, organised in a way that actually makes the stories connect. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button, so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this video together because weapon item descriptions in Bloodborne are genuinely one of the most efficient ways to understand the broader lore of the game, and a surprising number of the details hidden inside them get overlooked even by longtime fans. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to group weapons not by when you pick them up during a playthrough, but by the factions, characters, and historical events they belong to. I cut a few minor consumable entries that were mostly duplicates of other items' lore, and instead expanded the coverage on weapons that have especially dense or underappreciated backstories. I think that approach makes the hidden connections between weapons far more visible than just following the progression order. So whether you already know this game inside and out, or you're just discovering it now, there is something in here that is probably going to surprise you. Chapter 1. The Hunter's Starting Arsenal. The first weapon most players ever hold in Bloodborne is the saw cleaver, and it is easy to take it for granted. It looks like a tool that was modified rather than designed from scratch, and that is actually exactly what the lore suggests. The item description tells us it is one of the oldest weapons of the workshop, implying that the very first hunters did not have purpose-built armaments. They adapted whatever was available, and a serrated saw blade mounted on a collapsible frame was apparently one of the most effective things they found. The serrated edge on the saw cleaver is not just a visual choice. The game explicitly notes that serrated weapons deal bonus damage to beasts, and this mechanic is tied directly to lore. Beast flesh is described elsewhere in the game as dense, layered, and difficult to cut cleanly. A serrated blade does not cut so much as it tears, and tearing is what actually damages beast tissue effectively. This tells you something important about the earliest hunters. They learned through brutal trial and error that smooth blades were insufficient, and they adjusted accordingly. The saw cleaver's transformation is one of the simpler ones in the game. It folds out from a compact form into a longer, extended configuration. This design detail points toward the practical needs of early hunters who would have needed to move through narrow alleys and tight spaces in Yharnam, then extend the weapon when they finally had room to swing. The city architecture itself seems to have shaped weapon design, which is a detail that is easy to miss when you're focused on the combat. There is a detail in the saw cleaver's description that often goes unremarked. It says the weapon is primarily used by beast hunters, and distinguishes this from the broader category of healing church hunters. This is a subtle but meaningful distinction. It implies that by the time the game takes place, there are already multiple factions of hunters using different weapons suited to different targets, and the saw cleaver belongs firmly to the street-level, practical tradition, rather than the more institutional church approach. The leather wrapping on the saw cleaver's handle is worth mentioning. In the game's visual design, the wrapping is clearly worn and rewound multiple times, with frayed edges visible. One reading of this detail is that the weapon has passed through many hands, which fits with the description of it being one of the oldest workshop weapons. Another reading is that it belongs to a hunter who maintains their equipment carefully despite the chaos of the hunt, which is its own kind of character detail. The saw spear arrives as an alternative starting weapon, and at first it seems like a simpler variant of the saw cleaver. But the lore around the saw spear is subtly different. The description says it is a far-reaching weapon with a saw incorporated into a spear design, and then adds that it is highly versatile. The emphasis on versatility over raw damage or specialization suggests that the saw spear was designed by a different generation of hunters, one that had moved past the improvised beginnings of the saw cleaver and started thinking more carefully about adaptability. The transformation of the saw spear is also more conceptually interesting than the cleavers. In its compact form, it is essentially a short saw on a handle, similar to the cleaver. In its extended form, it becomes a proper spear with the saw blade deployed at the tip. What this means mechanically is that the hunter is choosing between close-range tearing and long-range thrusting, two completely different combat philosophies within the same weapon. The in-law implication is that the hunter using this weapon had thought carefully about which enemies they might face and wanted options. One small detail about the saw spear that points toward deeper lore is the way its handle is designed. It has a screw mechanism that locks the extended form in place, which you can see in the model if you look closely. This is a more refined piece of engineering than the saw cleaver's folding mechanism. It suggests a later manufacture date and a workshop that had time to refine its designs. When you hold both weapons side by side conceptually, you can see the evolution of workshop thinking from pure improvisation toward genuine craft. The saw spear also handles differently against certain enemy types in a way that reflects its lore. Because the serrated component is present, but the primary mode is a thrust rather than a wide swing, it is slightly less effective against groups of beasts, but more effective against single large targets. This mirrors what the lore description implies about versatility. It is a weapon that sacrifices some specialization to remain useful in a wider range of situations, which is what a versatile weapon should do. Both the saw cleaver and saw spear are associated with the hunter's workshop rather than the healing church, and this distinction carries weight throughout the game. The workshop existed before the church's hunter program, and it operated with a different philosophy. Workshop hunters were more independent, more practical, and less ideologically motivated. The weapons they made reflect this. They are functional, modifiable, and designed for the realities of fighting actual beasts rather than for ceremony or symbolic meaning. The hunter axe is the third starting weapon option, and it represents a different branch of the workshop tradition. Where the saw weapons are built for mobility and beast tearing, the hunter axe is built for raw power against large targets. The description notes that it is used for tackling gigantic beasts, and that the large motion required puts the wielder's entire body into each attack. This is not a subtle weapon, it is a commitment. The hunter axe's transformation is one of the most satisfying visual moments in the early game. It telescopes out from a hand axe into a long halberd-like configuration, dramatically extending the weapon's reach. What the lore suggests about this transformation is that it was designed to deal with the sheer scale of the beasts that showed up in Yharnam. A hand axe is useless against a cleric beast. A halberd at least gives you a fighting chance. The transformation mechanism was a practical solution to a scale problem. There is a real-world reference embedded in the hunter axe's design that is easy to miss. The extended configuration closely resembles a vulge or a bill, which are European pole weapons from the medieval period that were specifically designed for fighting opponents much larger or more heavily armoured than the wielder. They were peasant weapons, made from agricultural tools mounted on poles, because peasants could not afford proper military equipment. The hunter axe's origins in improvisation and adaptation mirror that real-world history almost exactly. The hunter axe is sometimes associated in fan discussions with Ludwig, the first hunter to serve the healing church, though the weapon itself predates that connection. One reading of the axe's design is that it represents the kind of weapon that would have been common before Ludwig's influence streamlined and refined the workshop's output. It is a blunt solution to a blunt problem, and Ludwig's later weapons are considerably more sophisticated. The axe is, in some sense, what the hunt looked like before someone sat down and thought about it carefully. The axe also carries an implicit message about what the hunt demands of hunters. The description's note about putting the entire body into an attack is a physical demand that shorter weapons do not make. A hunter using the axe has to fully commit to every swing, which leaves them open and exposed for a moment with every attack. The weapon demands a kind of courage or perhaps recklessness that the more nimble weapons do not. That thematic detail fits with the broader idea of hunters as people who have to push themselves past normal human limits. The threaded cane is perhaps the most thematically interesting of the starting weapons because it is the only one that does not look like a weapon at all until it transforms. In its base form, it is a walking cane with a decorative handle, the kind of thing a Yharnam noble might carry. The description tells us it is the weapon of choice for hunters of a more refined background, and that it can be used as a whip when unthreaded. This is one of the game's clearest class signifiers built into weapon design. The lore implication of the threaded cane is that not everyone who became a hunter was from the same social stratum. While the saw cleaver and hunter axe suggest working-class practical hunters who needed functional tools, the threaded cane suggests that some hunters came from wealth and kept their social identity even as they took up the hunt. The weapon's disguise as a cane allowed them to move through Yharnam's upper-class neighbourhoods without drawing attention, which tells you something about how the hunt was organised and who it involved. There is a real-world historical connection to the threaded cane that deepens its lore. Sword canes and weapon canes were genuinely common among European aristocracy during the 18th and 19th centuries, the exact period that Bloodborne seems to draw from aesthetically. These were not just novelties, but practical self-defense tools carried by people who were expected to project wealth and elegance rather than military readiness. The threaded cane slots directly into that tradition. The whip form of the threaded cane deals bonus damage to beasts, which is a mechanical detail with a lore implication. Whips were used historically as a form of crowd control and discipline, and the idea of a refined hunter using a whip against a beast has a certain grim humour to it. But beyond that, the whip form's ability to hit multiple enemies in an arc suggests that the refined hunters who used this weapon were thinking about crowd control rather than single-target efficiency. That is a different tactical philosophy from the axe user who goes straight for the biggest threat. The threaded cane's most interesting lore detail might be what it implies about Yharnam's social structure before the game begins. The hunt has been going on long enough that an entire culture of hunting has developed, with different weapons for different social classes. The cane suggests that hunting was not just a desperate street-level response to an emergency. It had become institutionalized enough that aristocrats could participate in it while maintaining their social dignity. That is either admirable or deeply disturbing, depending on how you read it. One detail about all four starting weapons that is worth noting is that they are all, in some sense, modular. They all transform. They all have at least two distinct modes with different uses. This is a workshop design philosophy that runs through almost every weapon in the game, and the starting weapons establish it immediately. The workshop believed that a hunter needed flexibility, not specialization. One weapon that could do multiple things was better than two weapons that could each only do one. The saw cleaver's lore also connects to the broader concept of beast transformation in the game. The description mentions that hunters learned early on that serrated edges were effective against beasts, which implies that beasts have a different physical composition than normal humans, and yet the people of Yharnam who transform into beasts were once human themselves. The weapon that is most effective against beasts is thus a weapon that is most effective against former humans, and the hunters who used it were killing people they might have once known. That is the kind of weight the game rarely states directly, but builds into every design detail. There is also something worth noting about the colour palette of the starting weapons. The saw cleaver and saw spear are largely grey and brown, practical and undecorated. The hunter axe has slightly more metalwork, but is still utilitarian. The threaded cane has a dark lacquered finish and decorative elements on its handle. Even the colour choices reflect the class associations of each weapon. Whoever designed these weapons thought about what they were saying with every visual detail. The Hunter Axe's telescoping mechanism deserves another look from a lore perspective. The mechanism that allows it to extend is clearly mechanical, with visible joints and locking pieces that you can see in the model. This is not magic, it is engineering. The workshop, whatever else it was a place where people solved practical problems with practical solutions. The weapons it produced are not enchanted items from a fantasy tradition. They are the products of a culture that approached monster hunting the way an engineer approaches a design problem. The saw cleaver and saw spear also have an interesting relationship with each other that is easy to overlook. They are clearly from the same family of weapon design, yet they were both retained in the workshop's catalogue rather than one replacing the other. This suggests that hunters did not all use the same weapon, which implies that the workshop was producing a range of tools for different hunters with different preferences and fighting styles. The workshop was not issuing standardized equipment, it was providing options, which tells you something about the independence hunters had in choosing their approach. The lore of the hunter's workshop itself is mostly communicated through these starting weapons, rather than through any single description. There is no item in the game that says, here is what the workshop was and what it believed. Instead, you piece it together from the saw cleaver's practicality, the saw spear's versatility, the hunter axe's commitment to raw power, and the threaded cane's awareness of social context. The workshop emerges as a place that took hunting seriously, thought carefully about the problems hunters faced, and produced weapons that reflected a genuine philosophy of adaptability and function. The threaded cane's connection to the broader narrative of Yharnam's aristocracy is worth exploring a little further. Canehurst Castle, which is accessible relatively early in the game, is home to Yharnam's old nobility, the Vile Bloods. The threaded cane is not explicitly a Canehurst weapon, but its association with refined hunters of noble background creates a thematic link. One possible reading is that some of Yharnam's minor nobility, not the full Canehurst line, but people adjacent to that world, took up hunting as a form of civic duty and chose the cane because it matched their self-image. The hunter axe has an interesting secondary resonance that comes from where you find most of the enemies who drop it in the game. In Yharnam streets, the lower-class hunters who have lost their minds and turned on each other are often carrying axes. This is not the hunter axe specifically, but the visual echo is intentional. The idea that an axe would be the weapon of choice for someone who descended into violence without the support structure of the workshop or the church fits with the weapon's character. It is the weapon of a person who needs something heavy and final. There is one more starting weapon detail worth covering before moving on. The game gives you a choice between these 4 weapons at the beginning, and the choice you make changes which weapon Gehrman gives you when he equips you in the hunter's dream. Gehrman is the first hunter, the one who established the workshop, and the fact that he is the one giving you these weapons is significant. He's not just handing you a tool, he is initiating you into a tradition that goes back to the very beginning of the hunt, and the weapon he gives you is the same class of weapon that tradition was built on. The hunter's dream itself, the space where Gehrman lives and where these weapons come from, is described in various item descriptions as a place outside of time. Weapons stored there do not age, they do not wear out, they persist in a kind of eternal readiness, available to any hunter who comes through. This detail, drawn from the messenger's descriptions and Gehrman's own dialogue, suggests that the weapons in the dream are not just equipment, they are something closer to sacred objects, preserved not because they are too valuable to use, but because they represent something that must not be lost. The messengers who manage the workshop's storage and commerce in the hunter's dream are themselves an interesting lore element. They are small pale creatures who appear throughout Yharnam and seem to be connected to the Great Ones in some undefined way. The fact that they handle the weapons says something subtle about the relationship between the hunt and the cosmic forces driving it. The weapons are not just human tools. They exist in a space managed by entities that are not human, and that contact with something inhuman may be part of what makes them effective against things that used to be human. The 4 starting weapons also collectively represent the 4 major approaches to hunting that the game offers: tearing and sawing against beast flesh, versatile adaptability, raw power against large opponents, and refined crowd control. Every weapon in the game can be mapped to one of these 4 basic philosophies in some way, and the starting weapons establish the vocabulary. When you pick up a new weapon later in the game, part of what you're doing is deciding which of these foundational philosophies it belongs to and how it refines or complicates that philosophy. One final detail about the saw cleaver that comes from its connection to other in-game items. There is a weapon called the saw cleaver and a separate item called the serrated weapons bonus gem, and the interaction between these 2 things reveals something about the workshop's approach to weapon enhancement. The workshop did not just make weapons, it made systems for improving weapons, which implies a long-term relationship with hunters who would keep using the same weapon across many hunts. You were not supposed to find a better weapon and throw your old one away. You were supposed to develop your weapon alongside your skill. The threaded cane has one final Easter egg that is worth noting here. The cane's tip, when you look at the model closely, has a metal cap that is slightly worn on one side but not the other. This suggests that whoever made this model thought about which direction a cane user would lean on it habitually. It is the kind of detail that does nothing for gameplay but says everything about the care that went into making Yharnam feel like a real place where real people had lived before everything went wrong. The 4 starting weapons are also linked by their connection to the Thumerian civilization, which the game reveals was the source of the beast plague that eventually consumed Yharnam. The Chalice dungeons, which contain the oldest evidence of the hunt, include versions of these weapons that appear to date from the earliest period of beast hunting. This suggests that the saw cleaver and its siblings are not inventions of the Victorian-era Yharnam that you explore in the main game. They are much older designs, refined and remanufactured across centuries of ongoing hunt. The weapons in your hands are the latest iteration of tools that people have been refining for longer than any living hunter can remember. Hunters also use these weapons to hunt each other, a detail that comes from the Hunter of Hunters questline, and from various items dropped by enemy hunters throughout the game. The workshop produced weapons for fighting beasts, but once you have a weapon effective against beast flesh, it is also effective against human flesh. The weapons that were designed to kill monsters became tools for killing people who had not yet become monsters, or people who had chosen a different philosophy of hunting. This moral weight is built into the design of every weapon, not stated but implied by what we know about how the hunt went wrong. The fact that all 4 starting weapons are still available and still effective late into the game, even without upgrades, says something about the design philosophy of Bloodborne as a whole. These are not beginner weapons that you replace and forget. They are foundational weapons that remain viable because they were designed well. That longevity is its own form of law. Good design endures, and the workshop, for all its involvement in Yharnam's catastrophe, was genuinely good at designing weapons. The final thing to note about the starting weapons is what they do not have. None of them deal elemental damage. None of them have built-in arcane effects. None of them require anything other than physical strength and skill to use effectively. This is a very deliberate choice, both mechanically and thematically. The earliest hunters fought without the aid of the arcane. They fought with metal and muscle, and they were largely successful. The introduction of arcane elements to hunting came later, as the Church deepened its understanding of the Great Ones. And that deepening understanding of the cosmic is also what led to Yharnam's downfall. The starting weapons represent a form of hunting that was brutal and imperfect, but also, in its own way, clean. Chapter 2: Weapons of the Workshop and the Healing Church. The Kirkhammer is one of the first weapons you encounter that was clearly made by a specific institution rather than improvised or developed organically. The item description tells us it is a healing church weapon and explains that it combines a stone hammer with a silver sword, two completely different tools united in a single trick weapon. The name itself is an Easter egg. Kirk comes from the Germanic and Scottish word for church, making the Kirkhammer essentially the church hammer. This is unusually literal naming for Bloodborne, which tends toward more oblique references, and it suggests that whoever named the weapon wanted its origin to be unmistakable. The two components of the Kirkhammer tell different stories. The silver sword, in its compact form, deals thrust damage and scales with strength, but its silver construction is the more important detail. Silver has mythological associations with purification and monster killing that stretch back through centuries of European folklore, and the healing church would have been aware of these associations. Silver weapons against supernatural creatures is a tradition the church seems to have deliberately incorporated into its weapon design, borrowing from folk belief and giving it an institutional form. The stone hammer is the other half of the Kirkhammer, and stone is a stranger material choice than silver. Stone predates metal as a weapon material, and using it in a device as sophisticated as a trick weapon creates an unusual historical layering. One reading is that the stone hammer represents something ancient, some Thumerian tradition of weapon making that the church absorbed and incorporated into its own arsenal. The stone might not be ordinary stone, but something quarried from chalice dungeon sites, which would give it properties that ordinary stone does not have. The Kirkhammer's split damage types, physical against beasts and arcane adjacent against kin enemies, reflects the healing church's dual focus. Early in the game's timeline, the church was primarily concerned with beast hunting. Later, as its understanding of the Great Ones deepened, it turned its attention toward kin, the humanoid creatures associated with cosmic intelligence. The Kirkhammer's design captures that transition. It is a weapon for hunters who might face either type of threat, made by an institution that had begun to understand both. The Kirkhammer is found in the Cathedral Ward, the neighbourhood that surrounds the Grand Cathedral, which is the healing church's main seat of power. This placement is not accidental. The weapon is located in the church's home territory, carried by the church's own hunters, and its design reflects the church's philosophy. When you pick it up, you're essentially picking up the church's official answer to the question of how a hunter should fight. The answer, the church says, is with silver and stone, and the willingness to hit something very hard. Ludwig's Holy Blade is the natural successor to the Kirkhammer in the church's weapon lineage, though it is more historically specific. The item description names it after Ludwig, the first hunter of the healing church, and says it is the most beloved weapon of the church's hunters. The word beloved is doing significant work in that description. Weapons are not usually beloved. Tools might be respected or valued, but love implies an emotional relationship that goes beyond utility. The Holy Blade was not just effective, it meant something to the people who used it. The transformation of Ludwig's Holy Blade is one of the most visually dramatic in the game. In its compact form, it is a longsword, elegant and manageable. In its extended form, it becomes a massive greatsword wrapped in cloth, nearly twice the size of the hunter wielding it. The cloth wrapping is the most interesting detail. One reading is that the cloth protects the blade during transport. Another is that the cloth is a kind of restraint, a way of binding a weapon that might otherwise be too dangerous to carry safely. The idea that a holy weapon needs to be restrained is a genuinely unsettling subtext. The cloth wrapping on Ludwig's holy blade connects to a broader pattern in Bloodborne's weapon design. Several weapons in the game are wrapped, bound, or otherwise constrained in ways that suggest the weapon contains something that needs to be managed rather than simply sheathed. This is different from a scabbard, which simply protects the blade. Wrapping suggests something more active, as if the weapon itself has a quality that must be contained. In the Holy Blade's case, the arcane resonance of the weapon when it is fully extended, visible as a pale glow, suggests that the cloth is dampening something. Ludwig's Holy Blade also has one of the most interesting origin stories in the game, though the story is assembled from fragments rather than stated directly. Ludwig, the first hunter, was a man who believed deeply in the sanctity of the hunt and the protection of Yharnam's people. He eventually transformed into a beast himself, the enormous horse-like creature you fight in the Old Hunters DLC, but retained his faith and his connection to his weapon. The description of the fight in the DLC, where Ludwig asks if you are a hunter of the church, and his relief when he sees the holy moonlight sword, suggest that his weapon was the last thread connecting him to his humanity. The Holy Blade's scaling, which favours strength with secondary skill, is a lore detail in mechanical form. Ludwig was described as a powerful warrior, someone who relied on physical might rather than finesse. The weapon he is associated with rewards that same approach, but the skill's secondary scaling suggests that not all church hunters who used it were pure strength builds. The weapon was designed to be usable by a variety of hunters, reflecting the church's need to equip a large and diverse group of warriors rather than just one legendary fighter. The church pick is a less celebrated weapon than Ludwig's Holy Blade or the Kirkhammer, but it has a lore detail that rewards close attention. The description says it is used by the Healing Church's specialized hunters and that it can be transformed into a longer version with fire at its tip. The fire element in the transform form is the interesting part. Fire is the weapon of choice against beasts throughout the game, and the church's endorsement of a fire weapon suggests that at least some of its hunters were still fighting beasts rather than kin, even as the church's attention had turned increasingly cosmic. The pick shape of the church pick evokes mining, and one reading of this association is that church hunters were thought of as people who dug into something, cutting through the surface to reach what was underneath. Beasts in Bloodborne are often described in terms of depth, the deep-rooted corruption of blood, the way beasthood grows from within. A pick is a tool for getting past a surface to reach what lies beneath. Whether or not this reading was intentional, it fits the church's stated mission of cleansing Yharnam of the beast plague, rather than simply containing it. The hunter's torch is one of the simplest weapons in the game, but carries some of the oldest lore. The item description says it is a torch used by hunters, which is perhaps the least surprising description of any item in Bloodborne. But embedded in that simplicity is a history. Fire was the first defense against beasts. Before there were trick weapons or workshop innovations or church-sanctioned equipment, there were people with torches driving back something that came out of the dark. The hunter's torch represents that original, desperate defense. Fire paper is a related consumable that temporarily adds fire damage to any weapon, and its description notes that fire is the most effective tool against beast flesh. The church would later develop the flame sprayer and the boom hammer as purpose-built fire weapons, but the paper suggests that even before those, hunters were improvising ways to add fire to whatever weapon they had. The combination of fire and the saw cleaver, to take one example, creates a kind of hybrid weapon that bridges the improvised early period and the institutional later period. Fire paper is what you use when you do not have the proper fire weapon but know you need fire. The hunter's torch also has a mechanical detail that reflects its lore. It is a left-hand weapon, meaning it goes in your offhand rather than your main hand. This mirrors the real-world practice of holding a torch in one hand and a weapon in the other, which is how hunters in stories have been depicted since long before Bloodborne. The game takes that image and makes it literal. You can carry a torch and fight with it simultaneously, which is both practical and thematically resonant. The Healing Church's weapons as a group share a design language that distinguishes them from workshop weapons. Workshop weapons tend to be utilitarian, modular, and relatively simple in their symbolism. Church weapons tend to be more elaborate, more specific about their damage types, and more closely tied to the church's institutional mythology. The Kirkhammer's silver and stone, the Holy Blade's cloth wrapping, the church pick's fire tip, all of these details reflect an organisation that was thinking carefully about what its weapons meant, not just what they did. There is an interesting contrast between the church's weapons and its enemies. The beast hunters who have gone mad throughout Yharnam carry crude weapons, improvised tools, and basic firearms. The Healing Church's ordained hunters carry carefully designed trick weapons that reflect centuries of refinement. The contrast suggests that there is a significant difference in resources and organisational capacity between the church and the individual hunters who were not under its protection. The church could afford to think carefully about weapons because it had the money and the institutional knowledge to do so. Ludwig's Holy Blade has a secondary lore connection that is easy to miss. The weapon's full name, including both the compact and extended forms, suggests that the compact form is the holy element, a long sword that any skilled knight might carry, while the extended greatsword form is the blade element, something more primal and destructive. One reading is that the transformation represents Ludwig's own duality, the holy warrior who served the church and the something else that he also was, powerful beyond what the church's theology could fully account for. The Kirkhammer's stone hammer component also has a connection to the Chalice dungeons that is worth noting. The Chalice dungeons are the ruins of a Thumerian civilization that predates Yharnam, and they are made of a distinctive grey stone that matches the stone used in the Kirkhammer's head. If this is intentional, and in Bloodborne's design most details are, then the Kirkhammer's hammer is made from Pthumerian stone, connecting the church's most iconic weapon to the civilization that the church's blood ministrations were ultimately derived from. The church built its power on Pthumerian foundations, and its weapons literally incorporated those foundations. The church pick's fire damage, in transformed form, raises a question about the Healing Church's relationship with fire. The church is primarily associated with blood, with transfusion, with the Great Ones and the cosmos. Fire is a more primal, older tool. The fact that the church designed a fire weapon, a tool, suggests that it had not abandoned the older traditions of beast fighting, even as it developed newer, more sophisticated approaches. One reading is that the church was always pragmatic, keeping what worked even as it moved toward new methods. Ludwig's Holy Blade was also clearly designed with a specific physical type in mind. The great sword form is enormous, larger than most enemies, and certainly larger than any normal human could comfortably swing. Ludwig himself was reportedly an exceptional fighter, and one reading of the weapon's design is that it was built for him specifically, calibrated to his unusual strength and reach. The fact that it is now a standard weapon available to any hunter might suggest that either hunters, in general, are stronger than they appear, or that the cloth wrapping in some way regulates the weapon's requirements, making it usable by people who are not Ludwig. The church pick has one more detail worth mentioning. In the game's exploration of the Healing Church workshop, which is a separate location from the main hunter's workshop, you find evidence of a parallel weapon development program. The church was not simply adopting workshop weapons and adding its own decoration. It was developing its own weapons with its own design philosophy. The church pick appears to be one of the earliest examples of this independent development, a church-designed weapon that has no workshop equivalent. The hunter's torch connects back to the starting weapons in an important way. All 4 starting weapons are designed for two-handed use, or at least benefit from two-handed fighting. The torch is a one-handed weapon by design, which changes the fighting stance fundamentally. A hunter using the torch in their offhand and a primary weapon in their main hand is fighting in a completely different configuration from a hunter using 2 hands on a saw cleaver. The torch introduces the concept of dual loadouts, and the weapons that follow it in the church's arsenal continue to develop that concept. The silver in Ludwig's holy blade and the kirkhammer suggests that the healing church was aware of the folklore traditions around silver and supernatural creatures. But in Bloodborne's world, the lore implication is that this awareness was based on actual observation, not tradition. Silver does appear to work against certain enemy types. The church likely discovered this empirically, fighting beasts and kin and noting which materials caused the most damage, and then incorporated that discovery into its official weapon designs. The church's weapons are in part a record of its experimental discoveries. The kirkhammer's stone hammer is also a symbol of the church's authority in a way that goes beyond weapon design. The hammer, as a shape, has associations with judgment, punishment, and the enforcement of law going back to Norse mythology and through most of European religious iconography. A mallet that looks like a hammer of justice in the hands of a healing church hunter implies that the church saw its hunters not just as warriors, but as enforcers of a divine mandate. The beast plague was not just a public health crisis to the church. It was a moral disorder requiring a moral remedy. Ludwig's holy blade's arcane resonance in its extended form, visible as a soft glow when the weapon is fully deployed, connects to the broader arcane system of the game in a way that is never fully explained. The glow implies that the weapon interacts with the arcane in some way, perhaps responding to it or drawing on it. One reading is that Ludwig, or whoever designed the weapon, incorporated a small amount of Pthumerian blood, or Great One material, into the blade, giving it properties that ordinary metal would not have. This would connect the church's most beloved weapon to the same source of power that eventually destroyed the church. The church pick's appearance in the game world also tells a small story. You can find it in an area of the cathedral ward that is occupied by church hunters who have gone mad or been transformed. The weapon on the ground among madness and death is a grim image. It suggests that the church's specialized hunters, the ones trained to use the pick, were among the first casualties of whatever went wrong in the game's late-stage catastrophe. A church pick lying in the street is evidence of a failed defense. Ludwig's holy blade drops from a specific enemy in the cathedral ward, a church hunter named the Healing Church Workshop Keeper, who carries it as his primary weapon. This enemy's role as a keeper of the workshop suggests that he was a caretaker of the church's weapon development program, someone with direct access to the most valued weapons in the arsenal. The fact that he is now hostile, either mad or defending the church's secrets with lethal force, is another piece of the broader story of the Healing Church's collapse. The kirkhammer, despite its imposing appearance and its association with the church's power, is ultimately one of the simpler weapons in terms of its lore complexity. It is a weapon of institutional power, designed by an organization with resources and intention to make a statement about what the church was and what it stood for. It is silver and stone, sacred material and ancient material in the hands of an official of an institution that believed it had both God and history on its side. The kirkhammer is confidence in weapon form, and the fact that the church is collapsing around you when you find it makes that confidence feel tragic. The hunter's torch has one more detail worth noting before we move on. The torch fire never seems to go out in the hunter's dream, even if you have had it for a very long time without using it. This is a small gameplay detail, but it connects to the hunter's dream's nature as a space outside time. The fire in the dream does not consume its fuel because time, and therefore entropy, does not work normally there. The torch in your hands might be the same torch that a hunter from 100 years ago carried, still burning, because nothing in the dream ever really ends. That is a melancholy detail once you understand what the dream is. The Church's weapons as a group also define the combat aesthetic of Bloodborne in a specific way. Workshop weapons were functional and improvised. Church weapons were designed and symbolic. The weapons of later factions, which we will cover in subsequent chapters, build on both traditions, but the Church's weapons established the idea that a weapon could mean something beyond its function, that the way a weapon was made said something about the person and institution that made it. That idea shapes every weapon in the game that came after. Chapter 3. The Holy Moonlight Sword. The Holy Moonlight Sword is, in the context of Bloodborne's lore, one of the most significant weapons in the game. It is also, in the context of From Software's game history, one of the most significant weapons in any game they have ever made. The Moonlight Greatsword, which is the direct ancestor of the Holy Moonlight Sword, has appeared in nearly every From Software game, from the Kingsfield series through Elden Ring. It is a piece of design that has been carried across decades of game development, always glowing blue, always arcane in nature, always connected to something vast and cosmic. In Bloodborne it becomes the Holy Moonlight Sword, and the transformation of the name alone suggests what the game is doing with the tradition. The word holy in front of Moonlight Sword is doing a specific kind of work. In previous From Software games, the Moonlight Greatsword was mysterious and arcane, but not holy in a religious sense. Adding holy connects it to the Healing Church's framework, to the idea that the arcane and the divine overlap in this world. The Church calls it holy not because it has blessed the weapon, but because it is connected to something that the Church has decided is divine. Whether that connection is actually divine or simply cosmic and incomprehensible is one of the game's open questions. The Holy Moonlight Sword's item description tells us that it was Ludwig's weapon, his most prized possession, and that he had lost it before the events of the Old Hunters DLC. The description says, the sword appears and disappears in an instant, like the flicker of a candle, suggesting that the weapon exists partly in another dimension or phase of reality. One reading of this detail is that the Moonlight Sword is not entirely a material object. It is partly something else, something that bleeds through into the physical world when conditions are right, which would explain both its arcane properties and its tendency to disappear. When you encounter Ludwig in the Old Hunters DLC, he is a massive beast, barely resembling the human he once was. But when you show him the Holy Moonlight Sword near the end of his boss fight, he responds with something like recognition and gratitude. He calls it his sword. He asks if you can see the moonlight. He reclaims for a moment the identity he had before the beast blood consumed him. The weapon restores his humanity, at least partially and at least temporarily, in a way that nothing else in the game does. This is one of the most emotionally resonant moments in Bloodborne, and it happens because of a weapon. The detail that Ludwig lost the Holy Moonlight Sword before the events of the DLC raises interesting questions. Where did it go? How does a weapon disappear from the possession of the first hunter of the Healing Church? One reading draws on the description's mention that the sword flickers in and out of visibility. Perhaps the sword slipped out of the physical plane entirely while Ludwig was transforming into his beast form, retreating to wherever it goes when it is not visible. Another reading is that the sword passed to another hunter or another keeper and only returned to Ludwig's possession, symbolically at least, when you bring it to his fight. The Holy Moonlight Sword deals arcane damage in its transformed form, not physical. This is a critical detail because it means the weapon's true power is not in cutting, but in its connection to the arcane world. The transformation triggers a visual effect where the blade becomes suffused with blue-white light, and the swings leave trails of that light in the air. One reading of this effect is that the weapon, in its transformed state, is reaching into the arcane plane and pulling energy from it into every strike. It is not hitting enemies with steel. It is hitting them with something that comes from somewhere the eye cannot fully follow. The visual design of the Holy Moonlight Sword is carefully calibrated to reference the Moonlight Greatsword of previous games without simply copying it. The blade's shape, the blue glow, and the scale of the weapon all echo the tradition, but the aesthetic has been updated to fit Bloodborne's Victorian horror setting. The handle has healing church design elements. The cloth wrapping that also appears on Ludwig's holy blade is present here in a more refined form, and the blade is more ornate than the previous iterations. It is a weapon that knows its own history and wears that history deliberately. The connection between the Holy Moonlight Sword and Ludwig's holy blade, which shares his name, is one of the more debated lore relationships in the Bloodborne community. Both weapons are associated with Ludwig. Both deal high damage in transformed form, and both have a certain grandeur that other weapons lack. One reading is that Ludwig's holy blade was a stepping stone weapon, something Ludwig used before he found or was given the Holy Moonlight Sword. Another reading is that the holy blade was named after Ludwig by the Church as an homage to his greatest weapon, in the same way that later rulers might commission replicas of legendary arms. The Holy Moonlight Sword's charge attack deserves special attention because of what it implies about the weapon's nature. When charged, the sword releases a large projectile of arcane energy, a crescent of blue light that travels across the ground. This is not a physical attack in any conventional sense. The sword is generating something. One reading is that the weapon is connected to the Great Ones in a way that allows it to summon or channel their energy. The crescent shape of the projectile is the shape of a moon, a detail that connects the weapon's name to its actual combat function. There is a reading of the Holy Moonlight Sword that places it in direct connection with the Great One, called the Moon Presence, which is the final boss of Bloodborne's base game. The Moon Presence is connected to the Hunter's Dream, to Yharnam, to the cycle of blood that drives the game's events. The Holy Moonlight Sword, which literally generates moonlight energy and is described as connected to something vast and external, might be a fragment of or a connection to the Moon Presence's influence. If the Moon Presence is the entity behind the dreams and the hunt, then a weapon that channels moonlight might be drawing on its power, whether the wielder knows it or not. The arcane scaling of the Holy Moonlight Sword in its transformed form is the highest of any non-purpose-built arcane weapon in the game. This means that a hunter who has invested heavily in arcane will find the weapon more powerful than almost anything else available. The lore implication is that the weapon rewards people who have developed a relationship with the arcane, people who have, in the game's terms, opened their minds to the cosmic. Ludwig himself may have had this quality, a deep attunement to the arcane that the Church recognized and cultivated, and that made him not just a powerful fighter, but something more than a conventional hunter. The Holy Moonlight Sword has a detail in its description about the wisdom of the Great Ones, a phrase that connects the weapon directly to the game's cosmology. The Great Ones, the game's equivalent of gods, communicate through dreams and through arcane experience. The Holy Moonlight Sword is described as possessing some of that wisdom, which implies that picking up the weapon is, in some small way, receiving a message from something that thinks in scales and dimensions that humans can barely perceive. The weapon is not just a tool, it is a conduit. There is a notable contrast between the Holy Moonlight Sword and the Burial Blade, Gehrman's weapon. Both are associated with the founders of the hunting tradition. Both deal arcane damage. Both are discovered relatively late in the game. But the Burial Blade is intimate, curved, designed for a specific fighting style that seems personal and idiosyncratic. The Holy Moonlight Sword is grand, expansive, designed to fill space and project power. The contrast suggests that Gehrman and Ludwig were fundamentally different kinds of hunters, and their weapons made those differences permanent. The Holy Moonlight Sword's appearance rate in fan art, cosplay, and community discussion far outweighs most other Bloodborne weapons, which is itself a form of lore in a broader sense. The weapon captured something about the game's themes that resonated beyond the gameplay, and part of that is the From Software tradition it participates in. When you pick up the Holy Moonlight Sword in Bloodborne, you are not just finding a powerful weapon, you are connecting to a lineage of design that goes back to the earliest games of one of the most important studios in the medium's history. That connection is part of what the weapon means. The moment you obtain the Holy Moonlight Sword is also worth examining from a narrative standpoint. Ludwig drops it after his fight, which means you receive it from the most tragic figure in the DLC, a man who served faithfully, transformed into something terrible, briefly reclaimed his humanity through the sight of his weapon, and then died. The weapon passes from him to you in a moment of both horror and grace, and the fact that it then becomes one of the most powerful weapons you can use feels weighted with that history. You are using a dead man's faith as a weapon. The Holy Moonlight Sword also connects to the game's broader meditation on sight and blindness. Several items and characters in the game reference the ability to see things that others cannot, the ability to perceive the great ones and the true nature of reality. The Holy Moonlight Sword generates visible light from an invisible source. It makes the arcane visible in a physical space. One reading of this is that using the weapon correctly requires the kind of sight that the game rewards with its true ending, the ability to perceive and interact with something that most people cannot see at all. Ludwig's name itself is a German given name, meaning famous warrior or famous battle, derived from the old German Hlud, meaning famous, and Wig, meaning war. The choice to give the first church hunter a German name in a setting that otherwise draws from Victorian England is interesting. It may be a simple aesthetic choice, or it may suggest that Ludwig came from somewhere other than Yharnam, a place more Germanic in character, perhaps connected to the healing church's European roots. Either way, the name carries weight. It is the name of someone who was meant to be remembered. The Holy Moonlight Sword's connection to the moon is also worth reading against the game's other moon-associated elements. The moon presence is the final boss. The hunter's dream is lit by a perpetual moon. The blood moon that appears in Yharnam's sky during the game's late stages is a moment of transformation and horror. The moon in Bloodborne is not a benign symbol. It is associated with madness, with the hunt, with the Great One's influence on human consciousness. A sword that channels moonlight is thus a sword that channels something deeply ambivalent, something that can restore humanity in one moment and drive someone to madness in another. One of the most interesting mechanical details about the Holy Moonlight Sword is that its arcane projectile, the crescent wave it fires on charged attack, deals arcane damage rather than physical. This means it bypasses the defense of enemies who are resistant to physical damage and hits instead their arcane resistance, which is often lower. The weapon is designed to find the weakness in things that seem impossible to harm. That is a profound weapon design choice, with a lore implication. The Holy Moonlight Sword was made for fighting things that ordinary weapons cannot touch. It was made for the impossible hunt. The Holy Moonlight Sword also has a specific sound effect in its charged and transformed state, a low resonant hum that distinguishes it from the other weapons in the game. Sound design in Bloodborne is carefully calibrated, and the hum of the Holy Moonlight Sword is designed to feel like it is coming from somewhere vast and slightly outside the space you're standing in. It is the sound of something that has a larger resonance than its visible form suggests. Whether this was designed with lore in mind or is simply effective sound design, it reinforces the sense that the weapon is connected to something beyond the physical world. The community discussion around the Holy Moonlight Sword often focuses on the question of what exactly Ludwig saw when he asked if you could see the moonlight. From the player's perspective, yes, you can see the moonlight the weapon generates, but Ludwig's question seems directed at something beyond that. He may be asking whether you share his particular form of enlightenment, his ability to perceive the Great One's influence. The moonlight might be a metaphor for a specific kind of awareness, and the weapon's light might be, in his damaged and beastly mind, the evidence that awareness is real. The Holy Moonlight Sword exists in an interesting position relative to the game's other arcane weapons. Most arcane weapons in Bloodborne were purpose-built for arcane use, either infused with elemental damage or designed around a specific arcane effect. The Holy Moonlight Sword is unique in that its arcane properties seem intrinsic, not added. It does not have an elemental infusion. The arcane is the weapon's nature, not something applied to it. One reading of this is that the sword was not made by human craft at all, at least not entirely, and that its intrinsic arcane quality is evidence of its non-human origin. The Holy Moonlight Sword's positioning in the DLC, hidden within Ludwig's boss fight, means that it is one of the most guarded weapons in the game. You cannot obtain it without first defeating Ludwig, which is one of the more challenging boss fights in the DLC. The message embedded in this game design choice is that the sword requires something of you before it can be yours. Not just skill, but the willingness to face something tragic and powerful and end it. The weapon tests you before it grants itself to you, which fits with the idea of the sword as a conduit for something that chooses its wielder. The Holy Moonlight Sword, in the final analysis, is a weapon that carries more weight than almost any other in the game, because it occupies multiple registers simultaneously. It is a tribute to From Software's own history. It is Ludwig's personal tragedy made into a pickup item. It is a connection to the Great Ones and their unknowable wisdom. It is the best arcane weapon in the game for players who have invested in that stat. All of these things are true at once, and that layering is precisely what makes Bloodborne's weapon design exceptional. The sword does not just tell one story, it tells all of them at once, and they do not contradict each other. Chapter 4. Gehrman and the Burial Blade. The Burial Blade is the oldest weapon in Bloodborne's lore. The item description calls it the weapon of the old hunters, and says that it was wielded by the first hunter, who is Gehrman. Before there was a healing church, before there was a workshop in any formal sense, before any of the institutional history of hunting in Yharnam, there was Gehrman, and Gehrman's weapon was the Burial Blade. That makes it the point of origin for everything else in the game's weapon history, the tool from which all other tools descend. The Burial Blade is a curved weapon with a blade that extends from a handle at an angle, giving it a crescent or scythe-like silhouette. The scythe is one of the oldest symbols of death in Western iconography, associated with the figure of death as a harvester of human lives. Gehrman, as the first hunter, the man who began the tradition of killing beasts that used to be human, carries a weapon that looks like the tool of death itself. This is either a deep thematic choice or an incredibly on-the-nose bit of symbolism, and in Bloodborne it reads as the former because everything else in the game's design earns that level of intention. The transformation of the Burial Blade is less dramatic than many other weapons in the game. It extends slightly, changing the angle and reach of the blade, but the change in moveset between the two forms is significant. The compact form allows for quick, close-range cuts. The extended form allows for sweeping attacks that cover a wide arc. Both forms deal arcane damage, in addition to physical damage, which is unusual for a weapon this old. Most early weapons in the game's lore are purely physical. The Burial Blade's arcane component suggests that Gehrman, from the very beginning, had some connection to the arcane that other hunters lacked. Gehrman's connection to the arcane is implied rather than stated throughout the game. He is bound to the hunter's dream, a space that is clearly arcane in nature. He is connected to the moon presence, the final Great One, in a way that is not fully explained. He makes the burial blade himself, and it deals arcane damage. One reading that connects all of these details is that Yharnam was, from the beginning, someone with an unusual sensitivity to the Great One's influence, and that the burial blade was designed not just as a weapon but as a tool for channeling that sensitivity into combat. The burial blade is also the weapon that Yharnam uses against you in the final confrontation in the Hunter's Dream. You can choose, at the end of the game, to refuse the offer of awakening from the dream, and if you do, Yharnam attacks you with his burial blade. He fights you with everything he has, moving faster and more elegantly than any human his apparent age should be able to, using the full range of the weapon's capabilities. In this context, the burial blade is not just a historical artifact, it is the measure of Yharnam himself, of what he can do when the circumstances require it. The fight with Yharnam in the Hunter's Dream is one of the most emotionally complex boss fights in any game. He is not a villain. He is not even clearly an antagonist. He is a man who has been trapped in a dream for what might be centuries, serving as a guide and mentor to an endless succession of hunters, most of whom he has had to cut down himself when their purpose was fulfilled. The burial blade is the tool he has used to carry out those mercy killings, the weapon of an old man who has been doing a terrible job for too long and has no way out of it. The description of the burial blade mentions that it is a weapon of the old hunters, and this phrase, old hunters, carries significant weight in Bloodborne's lore. The old hunters are distinct from the current generation in a way that is never fully explained but suggests a difference in philosophy and method. The old hunters, the ones Yharnam represents, were hunters before the healing church existed, before the institutionalization of the hunt, before the arcane and the cosmic became central concerns. They hunted with what they had and did what the job required, without the ideological framework that the church later built around it. The arcane damage of the burial blade is worth returning to because it connects to a specific detail in the game's lore about what arcane damage represents. Arcane damage, in Bloodborne's terms, is damage that comes from the realm of the Great Ones, from the space between the physical world and the cosmic world that the Great Ones inhabit. The burial blade dealing arcane damage from the beginning suggests that the earliest beasts were not just physical threats. They had a component that could only be addressed through arcane force. This retroactively complicates the idea that the old hunters were simpler or less cosmically aware than later generations. You can only obtain the burial blade as a player by purchasing it from the Insight store in the Hunter's Dream, which means it cost insight rather than blood echoes. Insight is the game's measure of cosmic awareness, gained by encountering Great Ones, or other sources of profound and disturbing knowledge. The fact that Yharnam's weapon costs insight to obtain is a small but meaningful design choice. You cannot simply buy it with the currency of the hunt. You have to pay with the accumulated cost of knowing too much, which is exactly what Yharnam himself has done across however many dream cycles he has been through. The burial blade's appearance is worn and old in a way that most other weapons in the game are not. The metal is darker, the edges appear more used, and the overall aesthetic is of a weapon that has seen more than it was originally designed to handle. This visual aging is unusual in a game where most weapons look relatively well maintained. The wear on the burial blade is a record of its history, of the countless hunts Yharnam has participated in, directly or through the hunters he guided. The weapon looks like what it is, the oldest thing in the world of the game. Yharnam's moveset with the burial blade when you fight him is noticeably different from the player's moveset with the same weapon. He uses it with a fluidity and efficiency that suggest decades or centuries of practice, anticipating your movements and flowing around them in a way that feels almost improvised. One reading of this difference is that Yharnam's version of the weapon has adapted to him over his long imprisonment in the dream, becoming an extension of him in a way that a newly acquired copy cannot be. The weapon in your hands is the same weapon, but it does not know you yet. The burial blade also has a connection to the game's central theme of mercy. Gehrman's role in the hunter's dream is partly to release hunters from the dream at the end of their service, which is implied to be a form of mercy. The weapon he uses for this purpose is not an execution device, but a blade that, in its arcane form, seems to cut something other than flesh. One reading is that the burial blade can sever the connection between a hunter and the dream, which is why it is the appropriate tool for Gehrman's task. It is a weapon designed to cut things that most weapons cannot reach. The word burial in the burial blade is interesting because burial is a funerary practice, a ritual of ending and memory. A blade associated with burial is a blade associated with the formal acknowledgement of death, with the ceremonies humans use to process the fact that things end. Gehrman, as the keeper of burial rites for hunters, cutting them loose from the dream when their work is done, carries a weapon named for the ceremony of ending. The name is both literal and metaphorical, and neither reading feels forced because Bloodborne's design earns both. The burial blade's transformation animation is worth watching closely because it reveals something about how Gehrman fights. The extension of the blade changes the weapon's center of balance, pushing it forward and downward, which changes the fighter's stance to accommodate the new weight distribution. This is not an arbitrary animation. It is a realistic representation of how different blade configurations affect a fighter's body positioning. Gehrman, who presumably developed this transformation himself, thought carefully about how to shift from one fighting mode to another in a way that maintained balance throughout. The hunter's dream as a lore element is inseparable from the burial blade because the dream is where the blade lives, where it is maintained, and where Gehrman has been using it for the duration of his imprisonment. The dream is described in various item descriptions as a place that exists outside the normal flow of time, which means the burial blade has been in that space for however long Gehrman has been there. An object that has spent an indefinite period in a space outside time might accumulate properties that objects in the normal world do not have. The burial blade's arcane properties might be in part a product of its long residence in the dream. There is a reading of Gehrman that makes the burial blade the most important object in the game, rather than just the first weapon. If Gehrman is the origin point of the hunting tradition, and the burial blade is his defining tool, then everything that came after, in terms of hunting weapons, is essentially a response to the burial blade. The saw cleaver responds to its practicality with more focused practicality. Ludwig's holy blade responds to its arcane quality with an amplified, institutionalized version of that quality. The burial blade is the ancestor of all of them, the design concept that all others built on or reacted against. The community has long debated whether Gehrman made the burial blade himself or received it from someone or something else. The description says it is the weapon of the first hunter, but does not specify its origin more precisely than that. One reading draws on the game's cosmology to suggest that the moon presence, as Gehrman's patron and jailer, provided the burial blade as part of the arrangement that bound Gehrman to the dream. Another reading, perhaps less dramatic but equally plausible, is that Gehrman was a skilled craftsman who made his own weapon before the hunt began, designing it for his own fighting style without any external influence. The burial blade has a secondary function in the game that is easy to overlook. It has slightly higher base arcane damage than most weapons of its upgrade level, and this base damage affects the arcane projectile it fires on certain attacks. This mechanic, which seems primarily aimed at combat optimization, has a lore implication. The weapon was designed with the arcane as a primary rather than secondary consideration. Gehrman built arcane into the core of the weapon rather than adding it as an enhancement. That reflects a deep and possibly innate understanding of arcane properties that most hunters did not have. The burial blade's relationship to the blood-starved beast, one of the game's early bosses, is indirect but interesting. The blood-starved beast is a hunter who's been transformed into a beast by the beast plague, and fighting it is one of the game's first encounters with what the hunt is really doing to people. Yharnam, who has been watching hunters succumb to the beast plague for however many dream cycles, would have witnessed this transformation countless times. The burial blade in his hands is the response to that witnessing, a tool calibrated for ending what the plague creates. The burial blade's moveset in the player's hands has a characteristic that makes it particularly effective against fast mobile enemies. Its attacks have a long follow-through that can catch enemies who try to circle away, and its wide arc in extended form covers enough space to hit multiple targets simultaneously. These are properties that reflect the specific challenges of fighting beasts, which tend to be fast and erratic in their movement. Yharnam designed the weapon for the specific problem he faced, and the design choices reflect a detailed understanding of how beasts move and fight. The last thing to say about the burial blade in this chapter is the most emotionally significant. When the game ends in any of its multiple possible endings, Yharnam is either dead at your hands, transformed into something else through the nightmare ending, or freed from the dream in the secret ending. In all cases, the burial blade either passes to you or is left behind. The weapon outlasts its creator, or possibly outlasts another iteration of its creator, and continues to exist in the dream, waiting for the next hunter. That persistence is the burial blade's final statement, that the hunt continues, regardless of what happens to any individual hunter, and the tools of the hunt will outlast every person who uses them. The burial blade also has a specific interaction with certain gem slots that allows it to be enhanced with blood gems in ways that amplify its arcane damage to unusual levels. This enhanceability, the capacity for the weapon to be developed and made more powerful by the hunter who uses it, mirrors the law of Yharnam himself. He was not static. He learned and adapted across countless dream cycles, developing his understanding of the hunt and of the arcane over a span of time that no normal hunter would have access to. The burial blade is a weapon that grows, just as Yharnam grew, through accumulated experience. The final boss fight with Yharnam and the burial blade's role in it raises one more lore question worth sitting with. If Yharnam is trying to free you from the dream by killing you, and the burial blade is the tool he has always used for this purpose, then fighting him and defeating him with another weapon is defeating the tradition of the hunt on its own terms. You are using the hunt's own tools against its founder, with the same purpose he had, but in the opposite direction. You are trying to stay, to survive, to not be cut loose, and whether that is wise or foolish depends on which ending you're aiming for. Chapter 5. Cainhurst and its weapons. Cainhurst Castle is one of the most visually distinctive locations in Bloodborne, and its weapons are equally distinctive. The Cainhurst line of weapons is associated with the Vile Blood faction, a group of aristocratic hunters who consumed the blood of the Great Ones in a way that the Healing Church deemed heretical. Everything about Cainhurst is excess. The architecture is too grand, the decorations too elaborate, the history too long. The weapons of Cainhurst reflect this character. They are refined to the point of impracticality, beautiful to the point of danger, and loaded with lore that the Healing Church would rather everyone forgot. The Chikagi is the most famous Cainhurst weapon, though it did not originate in Cainhurst. The item description tells us it was brought from an undisclosed eastern land, which in Bloodborne's geography points towards somewhere analogous to Japan or another East Asian culture. The weapon itself is a katana, an immediately recognizable blade type, with a long tradition in Japanese sword culture. The word Chikage appears to be Japanese in construction, and while its exact meaning in the game's context is not confirmed, it evokes something like blood shadow or blood flower in its component parts. The name fits the weapon's function almost too well. The Chikage's transformation is one of the most unusual in the game. In its base form, it is a standard katana with no special properties beyond its high blood tinge scaling. In its transformed form, the blade is suffused with blood, not just metaphorically, but literally, as the user's own blood is drawn from their body to coat the blade. This costs health continuously while transformed, but the damage output increases significantly. The lore implication of this mechanic is explicit. Vile blood weapons feed on the user. The vile blood's power came at a cost, and the weapons they used embodied that cost directly. The blood sacrifice mechanic of the Chikage connects to the game's broader meditation on blood as both life and poison. Throughout Bloodborne, blood is the medium of healing, of enhancement, of transformation, and of corruption. The Chikage forces the user to decide how much of themselves they are willing to spend for power, which is a very direct metaphor for the vile blood philosophy. The vile bloods pursued the blood of the great ones at personal cost and against the prohibitions of the church. The Chikage makes that trade-off literal in every transformed swing. The Chikage's connection to Lady Maria is one of the game's more debated lore details. Lady Maria is a descendant of the Cainhurst line and a hunter who served in the research hall. She uses the rakuyo, another weapon from an eastern land, rather than the Chikage. The implication one reading suggests is that Maria deliberately chose not to use the Chikage despite her Cainhurst heritage. The Chikage represents everything she may have been trying to escape. The blood cost, the vile blood identity, the association with a faction the church had destroyed. Maria's choice of the rakuyo over the Chikage is a character choice expressed entirely through weapon selection. The Reiter Palish is the other major Cainhurst weapon, and it represents a different aspect of the vile blood aesthetic. The name is German in origin, combining Reiter, meaning rider or cavalryman, with Palash, a type of heavy cavalry sabre. The combination is appropriate for Cainhurst, whose aesthetic draws from an aristocratic European tradition in which cavalry officers were at the top of the military hierarchy. The Reiter Palash is not just a weapon, it is a rank insignia in weapon form. The Reiter Palash's transformation converts it from a rapier-like sword into a firearm configuration. This is one of the most unusual transformations in the game because the weapon literally changes from a close-range blade to a ranged weapon, rather than simply extending or folding into a different shape. The gun barrel is built into the blade itself, and when transformed, the sword becomes effectively a pistol that can fire bullets. This design is a practical expression of Cainhurst's position as an isolated faction that had to be self-sufficient. A weapon that could both slash and shoot was an efficient use of limited resources. The blood tinge scaling of the Reiter Palash, like the Chikage, is one of the highest in the game. Blood tinge in Bloodborne determines the effectiveness of blood-based attacks, including firearms. The vile bloods, who were defined by their relationship to blood, naturally had weapons that scaled with this stat. This is not a coincidence. The Healing Church used primarily physical and arcane weapons because its philosophy centered on physical power and cosmic knowledge. The vile bloods used blood-scaling weapons because their power came from blood. The weapon design reflects the fundamental philosophical difference between the two factions. The Evelyn is the Cainhurst firearm, a pistol with exceptionally high blood tinge scaling. The item description says it is a weapon used by Cainhurst hunters and that it fires using blood rather than conventional bullets. The visual design of the Evelyn is noticeably more ornate than the standard hunter firearms, with decorative filigree and a handle that looks like it belongs in a ballroom rather than a hunt. But the decorative appearance obscures a weapon that, in the hands of a high blood tinge hunter, is one of the most effective firearms in the game. Cainhurst's aesthetic of hiding power behind beauty runs through every weapon associated with it. The name Evelyn is interesting in context. It is an English given name, traditionally feminine, which creates a contrast with the weapon's function as a deadly firearm. Naming a gun after a person, particularly a feminine name, has historical precedent in real-world firearms naming conventions. In Cainhurst's context, it suggests that the weapon was created in honor of or in memory of a specific person, though no item in the game identifies who Evelyn was. She is a mystery built into the weapon's name, a ghost haunting a pistol. The Cainhurst weapons collectively tell the story of a faction that was aesthetically sophisticated but ultimately doomed. The castle itself is described as frozen in time, its inhabitants slaughtered by the executioners who came at the healing church's orders. The weapons survived because they are weapons, durable, maintained, passed from hand to hand. But they carry the history of a massacre. Every Chicage and Reiter Palace in the game is, in some sense, a survivor of Cainhurst's destruction, an artifact of a culture that no longer exists except in these objects and in Queen Annalise, who persists in the castle in an undying state. Queen Annalise herself is a significant lore element because she is the source of the corruption rune, which is the Vile Blood Covenant item. The rune's description says that Cainhurst hunters collected the blood of hunters they killed and offered it to the Queen. This connects the Cainhurst weapons directly to a practice of ritual violence against other hunters, which explains the healing church's hostility toward the Vile Bloods. From the church's perspective, the Vile Bloods were not just heretics but active predators within the hunting community. From the Vile Bloods' perspective, they were simply conducting a different kind of hunt. The threaded cane has a connection to Cainhurst that is easy to miss. The description says it is the weapon of choice for hunters of a more refined background. Cainhurst nobles represent the most refined background in Yharnam's social hierarchy. While the cane is not explicitly a Cainhurst weapon, the lore connection between refinement and Cainhurst makes the cane the natural weapon for hunters who had come from or been influenced by that world. Some of the enemy hunters who carry threaded canes throughout the game are wearing clothing that has visual echoes of Cainhurst's aesthetic, which reinforces this reading. The Chicage's origin in an eastern land raises a question about how it came to Cainhurst in the first place. One reading draws on the game's mention of merchants and travellers in Yharnam's history. Another reading connects the Chicage to Lady Maria's backstory, suggesting that Maria, as a Cainhurst descendant, brought or encountered the Chicage through family connections. But the description says the Chicage was used by Cainhurst hunters generally, not just by Maria, which implies it had been part of the Cainhurst arsenal for some time before the castle's destruction. Trade routes, diplomatic gifts, or the spoils of some undescribed conflict might explain its presence. The Cainhurst weapons also share a visual design language that distinguishes them from workshop and church weapons. Cainhurst weapons are sleeker, more tapered, with decorative elements that emphasize elegance over practicality. The Chicage's long, thin blade, the Reiter Palace's rapier-like form, and the Evelyn's filigree work all reflect a design philosophy that prioritizes appearance alongside function. This is not vanity, it is a deliberate statement about the kind of hunter Cainhurst produced, someone who believed that how you fought was as important as whether you won. The blood-tinged weapons of Cainhurst are the only major group of weapons in the game that scale primarily with a stat that most players do not invest in. Blood-tinged builds in Bloodborne are a dedicated choice, not a casual one, and the reward for that dedication is a unique playstyle centered on firearms and blood-powered melee. The lore implication of this mechanical distinction is that Vile Blood hunters were specialists, people who had committed fully to a specific approach and had designed their weapons around that commitment. There was no half-measure Vile Blood hunter. You were all in, or you were not Cainhurst. The executioners who destroyed Cainhurst used the Ligarius wheel and other heavy, blunt weapons specifically designed to counter the Vile Blood style. The Cainhurst weapons prioritize speed and precision. The Executioner weapons prioritize mass and impact. The weapon design of the two factions reflects their tactical relationship. The Vile Bloods used weapons that could exploit openings in a heavy armor wearer's defense, and the Executioners used weapons that could absorb or deflect the quick attacks of a Cainhurst-style fighter. The whole faction war is legible in the weapon design choices. The Reiter Palash's built-in firearm element also says something about Cainhurst's tactical approach. Rather than keeping the firearm separate, as most hunters do, the Cainhurst weapon integrates it into the blade. This integration means that a Vile Blood hunter could transition from sword fighting to shooting without changing weapon or grip, a significant tactical advantage in close combat. It also means the weapon is more complex and more expensive to manufacture, which is entirely consistent with Cainhurst's position as a faction with aristocratic resources. The Evelyn, as the dedicated Bloodting firearm, pairs with the Chicago and Reiter Palash to create a complete Vile Blood hunter's loadout. This implied complete set is itself a piece of lore. The Healing Church's hunters have a complete set too: a church weapon, a firearm, and a hunter tool. The Workshop hunters have a complete set. The Vile Bloods had a complete set, which means they were as institutionally organized as their enemies, even if on a smaller scale. Cainhurst was not a ragtag group of heretics. It was a structured faction with specialized equipment. The destruction of Cainhurst by the Executioners is one of Bloodborne's most significant off-screen events, and the weapons that survived it are the primary evidence of what was lost. No Cainhurst hunter is alive in the game's present, except Alfred's mad version and Queen Annalise in her cursed state. But the Chicago, the Reiter Palash, and the Evelyn are all obtainable, all functional, all effective. The weapons survived the purge even though the people who made them did not. In Bloodborne, weapons outlive their owners regularly, but in Cainhurst's case, the survival of the weapons feels particularly poignant. The Cainhurst weapons also have a specific texture quality in their models that differs from other weapons in the game. The metals used in Cainhurst weapons appear to have a slightly different reflective quality, catching light in a way that is characteristic of a different metallurgical tradition. This visual detail might suggest that Cainhurst had access to materials or manufacturing processes that the workshop and the church did not, whether through trade with the Eastern land that provided the Chicago or through their own independent refinement of Yharnam's resources. Cainhurst's isolation did not mean poverty. It meant a different kind of wealth. The corruption rune associated with the Vile Blood Covenant transforms the player into a Vile Blood, and one reading of this transformation is that all Covenant items in Bloodborne carry a bit of the faction's identity. Taking the rune means adopting the Vile Blood approach to hunting. The weapons associated with the Covenant, particularly the Chikagi, become more thematically appropriate when you have the rune equipped. You are playing as a Vile Blood, using Vile Blood weapons, living the Vile Blood philosophy of blood as power and cost simultaneously. The Cainhurst aesthetic also connects to Gothic and Victorian literature's association of aristocracy with vampirism. The blood drinking, the elaborate castle, the immortal queen, the refined weapons, all of these elements draw on the vampire archetype in a way that Bloodborne's world has internalized and made its own. The Cainhurst weapons are vampire weapons in the tradition that runs from Bram Stoker through countless interpretations, but Bloodborne refuses to make them silly or campy. They are weapons of genuine power that come at a genuine cost, and the vampire aesthetic is treated with the same seriousness as everything else in the game. One final detail about the Chicago that is worth noting. The blood that coats the blade in transformed form does not behave like blood in any physically realistic way. It clings to the blade, moves with the weapon's swings, and seems to have a weight and momentum of its own. This is a deliberate visual design choice. The blood is not just a coating, it is something more active, more alive, more responsive to the will of the person using the weapon. One reading is that the blood on the Chicag is not just the hunter's blood, but some admixture of the vile blood essence, the blood of the Great Ones, that the Cainhurst line had incorporated into their own. The weapon is not just using your blood, it is using what the vile bloods became. Chapter 6. The Hunter of Hunters. The Blade of Mercy is the weapon most directly associated with the concept of mercy in Bloodborne, which is itself a concept that the game treats with considerable complexity. The item description says that the weapon is used by Hunters of Hunters, a faction within the hunting tradition dedicated to killing hunters who have gone mad or lost their humanity. The Blade of Mercy is not a weapon for killing beasts. It is a weapon for killing people, specifically people who were once colleagues, who shared the same purpose and who have now become something that cannot be allowed to continue. The mercy in the name is a mercy of ending rather than sparing. Eileen the Crow is the character most associated with the Blade of Mercy, and she appears throughout the game as a mentor figure and eventually as a boss fight if you fail her questline. Her crow mask and dark clothing reflect the hunter of hunters' aesthetic, unobtrusive, patient, designed for a kind of work that does not want to be seen. The Blade of Mercy reflects the same aesthetic. It is a small weapon, easily concealed, designed for precision rather than power. A hunter of hunters cannot afford flashy weapons or dramatic entrances. They need to be able to do the job quietly and completely. The Blade of Mercy deals arcane damage in its transformed state, which connects it to the broader arcane tradition of Bloodborne's weapons. But in this weapon's context, the arcane damage feels less like cosmic power and more like a specific kind of precision, the ability to cut something that conventional damage cannot reach. Hunters who have gone mad are, in Bloodborne's lore, beginning a transformation that takes them beyond normal human physiology. A weapon that deals arcane damage might be more effective against that partially transformed state than one that deals purely physical damage. The Blade of Mercy was designed for its specific task. The transformation of the Blade of Mercy is one of the most understated in the game. In its base form, it is a single dagger, fast and precise. In its transformed form, it splits into a pair of blades, giving the hunter a dual-wield configuration. This transformation represents the escalation of the Hunter of Hunters approach, the single blade for careful, targeted work, and the dual blades when more decisive action is needed. Both forms are quiet. There is no dramatic expansion or elaborate mechanical extension. The Blade of Mercy transforms in a single controlled motion, because that is what this weapon is about. The crow imagery associated with Eileen and the Blade of Mercy connects to a long tradition of corvid symbolism in world mythology. Crows and ravens are associated with death in Norse mythology, in Celtic tradition, in Japanese folklore. They are the birds of battlefields and funerals, and they appear in mythology as guides of the dead and witnesses to the end of things. Eileen's crow mask and the covenant associated with her, called the Hunter of Hunters, position the Hunter of Hunters as a kind of death guide, someone who ensures that hunters end properly rather than being allowed to persist in a degraded form. The lore of the Blade of Mercy also connects to the game's broader theme of what it means to maintain humanity in the face of transformation. Eileen's purpose is to protect the hunt's integrity by removing hunters who have lost theirs. But the game complicates this by showing, through Eileen's questline, that the Hunter of Hunters also risks losing their humanity through the weight of what they do, killing people you once respected, hunting colleagues, carrying the weight of those necessary deaths. All of this is a form of corruption that the Blade of Mercy participates in, even as it tries to prevent. The arcane damage of the Blade of Mercy in transformed form has a secondary mechanical function that reflects its lore. Arcane damage is effective against kin enemies, the humanoid creatures associated with the Great Ones. A hunter who has begun to transform away from humanity towards something more cosmic, which is one reading of madness in Bloodborne's terms, becomes partially kin-like. The Blade of Mercy's arcane damage, being effective against such targets, is a design choice that makes the weapon specifically suited to the kind of target the Hunter of Hunters pursues. There is a specific item associated with the Hunter of Hunters Covenant, the Crow Hunter badge, which allows you to purchase the Blade of Mercy and other items. The badge connects the individual hunter to the tradition, and acquiring it from Eileen is one of the game's more bittersweet optional storylines. If you follow Eileen's questline correctly, she passes the Covenant on to you, accepting that she can no longer complete her mission and trusting you to continue it. The Blade of Mercy, in that context, is an inheritance. The burden and the responsibility of the Hunter of Hunters pass from one person to the next. The connection between the Blade of Mercy and the Burial Blade is worth exploring because both weapons are associated with ending hunters. Gehrman ends hunters in the hunter's dream when their purpose is fulfilled, cutting them loose from the dream. The Hunter of Hunters ends hunters in the physical world when they have lost their purpose and become dangerous. Both roles are forms of mercy in the game's terms. Both weapons, the Burial Blade and the Blade of Mercy, deal arcane damage and are associated with a tradition older than the Healing Church. One reading is that both weapons descend from the same original philosophy, the understanding that the hunt must be bounded, that there are conditions under which a hunter must be ended. The Blade of Mercy's size relative to other weapons in the game is a significant detail. It is one of the smallest weapons in Bloodborne's arsenal, and its attack power in raw terms is lower than most other weapons. What it offers instead is speed, precision, and the ability to apply damage very quickly and from difficult angles. A Hunter of Hunters, by the logic of the weapon's design, wins not by hitting harder, but by hitting more accurately and more persistently than their target can tolerate. This is a different approach from the workshop weapon's commitment to practicality or the church weapon's commitment to symbolism. The Blade of Mercy commits to efficiency. The dual-wield configuration of the Blade of Mercy in transformed form is one of the few in the game, and it changes the fighting style fundamentally. Dual wielding sacrifices the ability to parry, since both hands are occupied with weapons. For a Hunter of Hunters, this is a meaningful trade-off. Parrying your target means getting close, making yourself predictable in a way that a dangerous, partially transformed hunter might exploit. Using both hands for offense and relying on dodging for defense is a different tactical philosophy, one that keeps the Hunter of Hunters in motion and makes them harder to respond to. The Blade of Mercy has a secondary connection to Yharnam's aristocracy that is easy to overlook. Daggers as weapons have historically been associated with concealment and close-range assassination rather than open combat, and their use has often been associated with roles that required discretion rather than military display. The Hunter of Hunters, as a clandestine operation within the hunting tradition, fits this historical weapon type perfectly. The Blade of Mercy is a dagger in the tradition of daggers, a weapon for necessary work done without spectacle. There is an interesting reading of the Blade of Mercy that places it in opposition to the saw cleaver. The cleaver is a weapon for killing beasts. The Mercy is a weapon for killing hunters. Both are effective in their respective domains. The existence of both weapons suggests that the hunting tradition recognized from early on that the hunt had two distinct problems: the external problem of beasts and the internal problem of hunters who had become beasts themselves. The workshop produced tools for both problems, which tells you something about how clear-eyed the original hunters were about what the hunt would cost them. Eileen's character and her weapon also connect to the theme of isolation that runs through Bloodborne's hunter tradition. Gehrman is isolated in the dream. The player character is isolated in the nightmare of Yharnam. Eileen is isolated by her role. Her job is to kill people who were once part of her community, which necessarily separates her from that community. The Blade of Mercy is the tool of that isolation, the thing she uses to maintain the separation between herself and the hunters she hunts. It is the weapon of someone who has accepted a profound loneliness as the cost of a necessary job. The Blade of Mercy's history is also the history of the hunter of hunters tradition, which is never fully explained in the game. We know that Eileen did not invent the role or the weapon. She is part of a tradition, but who created the tradition, when, and in response to what specific event is left unspecified. One reading draws on the burial blade's antiquity to suggest that the hunter of hunter's role emerged early in the hunting tradition, when Gehrman or his contemporaries recognized that some hunters were going to go wrong and that someone needed to handle that. The Blade of Mercy might be nearly as old as the burial blade, just less famous because its purpose was not meant to be celebrated. One detail about the Blade of Mercy that players often discover through experimentation rather than description is that it has an unusual thrust attack in dual-wield mode that deals a burst of quick hits. This burst of precision strikes is the weapon showing its most efficient form. Not one powerful hit, but many accurate ones, delivered so quickly that the target has little opportunity to respond. This is exactly what you would want in a weapon designed to end something before it can retaliate, which is what the hunter of hunters needs. The weapon's design, even at the level of specific attack moves, reflects its stated purpose. The crow aesthetic of Eileen's equipment, including the crow hunter badge and her clothing, raises the question of whether the crow is a symbol chosen by the hunter of hunters as a group or something specific to Eileen. If it is a group symbol, then there are or were other hunter of hunters wearing crow imagery. A small dark-clad faction moving through Yharnam's shadows with small fast blades. The image is evocative. If it is specific to Eileen, then the crow is her personal symbol, something that means something to her history before she became a hunter of hunters. Both readings add depth to the weapon. The Blade of Mercy's role in the game's covenant system makes it slightly more accessible than weapons tied to purely optional content, because Eileen's questline is well signposted, even if it requires specific player actions at specific times. But the emotional weight of the questline means that players who obtain the weapon through the proper path have a different relationship to it than players who simply buy it with the Crow Hunter badge. In one case, it is an inheritance from a woman who trusted you with her life's work. In the other, it is a purchase. Both are valid, but they feel different, and that difference is itself a piece of lore. The final detail about the Blade of Mercy that belongs in this chapter is its relationship to the game's ending. If you choose the option to refuse Gehrman's offer in the Hunter's Dream and fight him, you are acting against the established order in a way that the Hunter of Hunters would theoretically oppose. You are a hunter who has refused to be properly ended, who has decided that the cycle of the dream should be challenged rather than accepted. The Blade of Mercy, the weapon of those who enforce proper endings for hunters, becomes ironic in this context. You might be carrying the very weapon that would be used against you if there were another hunter of hunters around to use it. Chapter 7. Arcane and Bolt Weapons. The Tonitrus is one of the few weapons in Bloodborne that generates its own elemental property without requiring infusion, fire paper, or any external modification. The item description says it is a trick weapon that strikes with the force of a lightning bolt, and that it was created specifically to combat the beasts of Pethumeria, who are described as particularly vulnerable to bolt damage. The name Tonitrus is Latin for thunder, and the Latin naming convention is unusual for Bloodborne's weapons, which tend toward English or German names. The Latin suggests something older or more formally academic, as if the weapon was designed by scholars rather than hunters. The Pthumerian connection of the tonitrus is its most important lore detail. The Pthumerian civilization predates Yharnam by a significant span and is the source of the blood rituals that the healing church eventually built its power on. If the tonitrus was made to fight Pthumerian beasts, then it either predates or coincides with the earliest period of the hunt, before the workshop existed in any formal sense. One reading is that the tonitrus was a Pthumerian weapon, made by the Pthumerians themselves to combat the first manifestations of the beast plague within their own civilization. This would make it the oldest type of weapon designed for beast hunting, predating even the burial blade. The tonitrus's bolt damage is generated through the weapon's own mechanism rather than through an external infusion. The weapon's head contains a system that produces electrical discharge on impact, similar in principle to a real-world electroshock weapon. In Bloodborne's terms, this is described as a natural property of the material, rather than an engineered effect, suggesting that whoever made the first tonitrus found a material or a method that naturally produced bolt energy. One reading is that Pthumerian civilization had access to materials from deep within the Chalice dungeon, ruins that had unusual electromagnetic properties. The transformation of the tonitrus converts it from a standard mace-like configuration into an enhanced form where the bolt energy is more concentrated and the weapon itself generates visible electricity. The visual effect of the transformed tonitrus is one of the more dramatic in the game. The weapon crackles and sparks with visible energy, creating a small area of electrical disturbance around the hunter's hand. This is not just aesthetic. In mechanical terms, the transformed form significantly increases bolt damage, meaning the visual effect corresponds to a real increase in the weapon's power. The weapon is literally doing more of the thing it was made to do. The beast vulnerability to bolt damage is established through several item descriptions and enemy behaviors in the game, and the tonitrus is the clearest expression of this mechanic in weapon form. But the vulnerability raises a question. Why are beasts specifically vulnerable to bolt? One reading draws on real-world observations that electricity affects biological systems in ways that can be lethal at much lower doses than mechanical damage. A beast's enhanced physiology, its greater size and resilience, might paradoxically make it more vulnerable to electrical damage, because its larger body provides more conductive surface area. This reading makes the tonitrus's design choice feel scientifically grounded in a way that fits Bloodborne's pseudo-Victorian aesthetic. The rifle spear is another weapon with an unusual design philosophy that reflects specific lore. The item description says it was crafted in the workshop and is a type of trick weapon that uses a specially fitted rifle. The combination of a spear and a firearm in a single weapon is conceptually interesting because a spear is a weapon of close range and a rifle is a weapon of long range. As a trick weapon, the rifle spear switches between these modes rather than using them simultaneously, but the implication of having both is that the hunter expected to fight at multiple distances in the same engagement. The rifle spear's description also mentions that it has a relatively simple transformation compared to other trick weapons, which it frames as a product of its design, emphasizing practical utility over mechanical complexity. This is a modest description for a weapon that is actually quite versatile in practice. One reading of the emphasis on simplicity is that the rifle spear was designed for hunters who needed a quick, reliable weapon rather than one that required extensive training to master. It is the workshop's practical philosophy applied to a specific tactical problem. What do you carry when you might need to fight at any range? The bolt damage mechanic in Bloodborne connects to a specific lore theory about lightning and the Great Ones. Several descriptions in the game connect lightning to the choir and to the research hall, where experiments on Great One biology were conducted. The idea that the Great Ones, or entities associated with them, produce electrical phenomena is supported by the appearance of certain kin enemies who use bolt-based attacks. The Tonatrus's bolt damage in this context might be fighting fire with fire, using a property associated with Great Ones to combat the beasts that arose from their influence. The Empty Phantasm. Shell is a hunter tool rather than a weapon, but it interacts with weapons in a way that makes it central to the arcane playstyle. The description says it is the shell of a phantasm, a Great One parasite that has been emptied of its inhabiting creature. When applied to a weapon, it temporarily adds arcane damage. The implication is profound. A Great One parasite, even when empty, retains enough of the arcane that it can fundamentally alter a weapon's damage type. One reading is that the phantasms are not just biological creatures, but arcane reservoirs, and their shells retain that arcane quality even after the creature has left. The connection between phantasms and the arcane system is one of the most interesting threads in Bloodborne's cosmology. The phantasms appear in various forms throughout the game, always associated with the Great Ones and always with some implied arcane significance. The Empty Phantasm. Shell makes that association mechanical. You can add the arcane to your weapon by using a piece of something that was once a Great One's companion or vessel. The boundary between weapon, biological matter, and cosmic influence becomes blurred, which is exactly the kind of blurring that Bloodborne's lore explores throughout. The Tiny Tonatrus is a hunter tool that functions similarly to the weapon but is designed for throwing. The description connects it explicitly to the same Pthumerian tradition as the main weapon, suggesting that the Pthumerians also developed ranged bolt weapons. The idea of a civilization that understood bolt weaponry well enough to create both melee and ranged versions suggests a more sophisticated understanding of electrical phenomena than the Victorian-era technology that shapes most of Bloodborne's aesthetic. The Pthumerians, in this reading, were not simply primitive ancestors, but a civilization with very specific and highly developed technical knowledge. The Rosmarinus is a hunter tool that generates holy water, using the arcane in a way that parallels the flame sprayer's use of fire. The name Rosmarinus is the Latin name for rosemary, a plant that has extensive associations with purification and protection in European folklore. Rosemary was placed in coffins used in wedding ceremonies and carried as a ward against evil spirits. The Healing Church's choice to name a holy water weapon after rosemary connects the Church's practices to folk religion traditions that predate formal ecclesiastical structures. The Church, for all its institutional power, drew on much older beliefs. The arcane weapons as a group are connected by their relationship to the Great Ones, and this relationship is complicated. Using an arcane weapon effectively requires high insight, the game's measure of contact with the cosmic. High insight makes the player more powerful with arcane tools, but also more susceptible to frenzy, the madness status effect associated with Great One contact. The mechanical trade-off mirrors the lore's central warning: understanding the Great Ones makes you more powerful, but also more vulnerable to what they represent. The arcane weapons are the most powerful tools in the game, and also the most dangerous path to walk. The bolt weapons specifically have a connection to the research hall in the DLC that deepens their lore. The research hall was where the Healing Church's most extreme experiments were conducted, including experiments on patients who were given excessive amounts of blood in an attempt to force communion with the Great Ones. Many of these patients developed bolt-based abilities, suggesting that the Great One's influence on human biology sometimes manifests as electrical phenomena. The Tonatrus and Tiny Tonatrus, weapons that generate bolt energy, might be attempts to replicate and weaponize that naturally occurring phenomenon. The auger of Ebritas is the most direct expression of the arcane tradition in hunter tool form. The description says it is a hunter tool that allows the user to call upon Ebrietas, the Great One, who remained on Earth after the others departed. The tool summons a writhing mass of tentacles that emerges from the user's hand and deals arcane damage in a small area. The image is disturbing in the specific way that Bloodborne excels at. The idea that a hunter can summon a piece of a Great One's anatomy and direct it at enemies implies a degree of intimacy with the cosmic that most hunters probably should not have. Ebrietas herself is one of the most accessible Great Ones in the game, a massive creature found in the Altar of Despair who serves as a late-game boss. Her presence in the cathedral ward suggests that the healing church had a specific relationship with her, keeping her close while studying her and potentially drawing on her as a resource. The auger of Ebrietas, which lets hunters summon her tentacles, implies that the church had developed a way to access Ebrietas's power in a controlled, weaponized form. This is either an impressive scientific achievement or an extremely bad idea, and Bloodborne's general attitude suggests it is both. The interaction between the arcane tools and the game's enemies reveals interesting lore details. Arcane damage is particularly effective against certain boss-type enemies and against kin creatures, but it is less effective against some beast-type enemies who have developed a resistance to it. One reading of this variation is that the Great One's influence on the physical world is not uniform, that some areas and some transformed creatures are more connected to the arcane than others. The weapons that exploit arcane damage are thus not universally superior, but situationally optimal, which fits the game's philosophy of no single correct approach. The A Call Beyond is the most powerful arcane hunter tool in the game, and also the one with the most dramatic lore implications. The description says it is a hunter tool imbued with the authority of the stars, and that it fires multiple bolts of arcane energy. The phrase authority of the stars is one of the most evocative in the game's item descriptions. Stars in Bloodborne's cosmology are connected to the Great Ones, some of whom appear to be stellar in nature. A weapon imbued with stellar authority is a weapon that draws on cosmic power at the most fundamental level. The Black Sky Eye is a hunter tool that fires a single powerful arcane projectile and is described as a left eye that has transformed into something that can perceive and project cosmic power. The visual design, a dark sphere that the hunter holds in their palm and fires from, is deliberately unsettling. The idea that a transformed human eye can become a weapon blurs the boundary between body and tool in a way that is characteristic of Bloodborne's most extreme lore. One reading is that the Black Sky Eye belongs to a hunter or a researcher who underwent arcane transformation, and whose eye retained its power even as the rest of them was lost. The arcane weapons collectively suggest a progression in the game's world from simple physical tools to increasingly cosmic ones. The starting weapons are purely physical. The church weapons add symbolic and elemental elements. The arcane tools invoke the Great Ones directly. This progression mirrors the narrative arc of Yharnam itself, a city that began with a beast problem and ended up involved in something cosmic and incomprehensible. The weapons tell the story of how far things went, and the arcane tools are the evidence of how far that was. Chapter 8. Fire, Powder, and the Boom. Hammer fire was the first tool of the hunt, long before the workshop developed trick weapons, long before the Healing Church commissioned its own arsenal. Hunters drove back the beast plague with fire. The hunter's torch represents this original approach, but the weapons of the later period that incorporate fire do so with considerably more sophistication. The boom hammer is the most dramatic fire weapon in the game, and it belongs to the old hunters period, the generation of hunters that immediately preceded the institutionalization of the hunt under the Healing Church. The boom hammer's item description says it is a weapon of the old hunters that makes use of the power of fire. The fire mechanism is built directly into the hammer's head, using a pump system that ignites on impact. The visual result is a weapon that functions as a conventional hammer most of the time, and then, on certain attacks, produces a significant burst of fire at the moment of contact. The fire is not sprayed onto the target like the flame sprayer. It detonates on impact, creating a brief but intense blast. The design philosophy is about concentration of force rather than sustained burning. The old hunters who used the boom hammer were, by the game's law, the generation that established many of the conventions that later hunters followed without fully understanding their origins. The fire tradition was one of these. The old hunters knew that fire worked against beasts before they understood why, and they incorporated fire into their weapons through experimentation rather than theory. The boom hammer looks like the product of experimentation, a functional fire weapon that uses an elegant mechanism but is not elegant in itself. It works because someone kept trying different things until this worked. The boom hammer's transformation from a compact form to an extended form is one of the straightforward ones in the game. The handle extends, giving the hammer greater reach and changing its attack arc. But the fire mechanism carries through both forms, meaning the old hunter using this weapon was committed to fire regardless of distance. This is different from weapons where the elemental property is a secondary feature of the transformed form. With the boom hammer, fire is always the point. The connection between the boom hammer and the powder keg hunters is one of the game's more interesting factional associations. The powder kegs were a splinter group from the main hunter's workshop who specialized in explosive and incendiary weapons. They were considered eccentric or reckless by the broader hunting community, and their weapons reflect their philosophy: powerful, dangerous, sometimes to the user as well as the target. The boom hammer was not necessarily made by the powder kegs, but its aesthetic and its fire-first philosophy aligned closely with their worldview. The weapon and the faction share a commitment to the idea that enough force, delivered correctly, can solve any problem the hunt presents. The flame sprayer is the powder keg faction's most characteristic weapon, described explicitly in its item description as a weapon created by the powder kegs. It produces a continuous stream of fire, a persistent attack rather than a burst. The boom hammer and the flame sprayer represent two different philosophies of fire weaponry: concentrated detonation versus sustained burning. Both are effective against beasts. Both reflect the powder keg's comfort with weapons that other hunters found too dangerous or too unpredictable. The powder kegs were not concerned about the weapon being difficult to control. They were concerned about whether it killed beasts, and if it did, it was good enough. The stake driver is a weapon that represents a different kind of concentrated force, a pile bunker mechanism that drives a stake into the target at high velocity. The item description calls it a weapon used by hunters of the older workshop and says it uses a complex mechanism to drive a stake through the target on certain attacks. This description understates what the weapon actually does. The complex mechanism is a spring-loaded or compressed air device that fires the stake with significantly more force than a physically delivered thrust could generate. The stake driver is a pneumatic weapon in a world that otherwise relies on gunpowder and physical leverage. The pneumatic mechanism of the stake driver is anachronistic in an interesting way. Pneumatic technology of the kind implied by the weapon's design did not develop in the real world until the industrial period, which Bloodborne's Victorian setting draws from. The fact that the hunter's workshop produced a pneumatic weapon suggests a level of engineering sophistication that the workshop does not always receive credit for. The workshop was not just making blades and handles, it was working with compressed mechanisms and timed release systems, which is genuinely advanced engineering. The stake driver's most powerful attack is the charge attack in transformed form, which fires the stake with maximum velocity at the moment of impact. The visual and audio of this attack are distinctive. The weapon bucks backward from the recoil of the firing mechanism, and the sound is a sharp crack rather than a melee impact noise. The weapon is pretending to be a melee tool until the moment it reveals its actual purpose, which is to drive something through a target with more force than a human arm can generate. This design principle, hiding a firearm-like mechanism inside a melee weapon, is a workshop specialty. The firearm paper is a consumable that adds fire to any weapon temporarily, and its description notes that it is processed from the leaves of a plant found in the Forbidden Woods. The Forbidden Woods is one of the game's more isolated areas, home to a community that had been sealed away from Yharnam proper. The fact that the fire paper's raw material comes from there suggests a trade or supply relationship between the main city and this isolated community, or perhaps that Yharnam's hunters had to source certain materials from dangerous places by necessity. Every consumable in the game has a supply chain, and that supply chain is part of the world's texture. The oil urn is a consumable that coats targets in oil, making them more susceptible to fire damage. The combination of oil urn and fire weapon or fire paper is one of the game's most effective elemental strategies, and its effectiveness tells you something about how the earliest hunters understood beast biology. They figured out that beasts could be made more vulnerable to fire through preparation, which implies systematic thinking about how to optimize a fire attack rather than simply throwing fire at things and hoping. The oil urn is evidence of tactical sophistication among hunters who are often depicted as purely reactive. The Molotov cocktail is another fire consumable, and it is one of the few consumables in the game with a real-world equivalent. Molotov cocktails, named ironically after a Soviet politician in the context of the Winter War, are improvised incendiary devices made from flammable liquid in a breakable container. The appearance of one in Bloodborne, named exactly as it is in the real world, is a fourth-wall adjacent moment in a game that usually prefers invented terminology. One reading is that this is simply a design choice for clarity. Another is that Bloodborne's world has its own equivalent of the name, and the translation has preserved it. The rope Molotov adds a delivery mechanism that allows the incendiary to be thrown in an arc rather than a straight line, enabling the hunter to lob fire over obstacles or into areas that cannot be directly targeted. This is a tactical refinement of the basic fire concept, and it demonstrates that fire, as a hunting tool, was not static, but developed over time. The rope Molotov might be a later invention than the regular Molotov, adding delivery precision to an existing weapon type. The boomhammer's relationship with fire paper and oil urns is interesting from a lore perspective. The boomhammer already deals fire damage. Applying fire paper on top of it adds redundant fire damage, which is mechanically useful, but lore-logically odd. Why would a hunter coat a fire weapon with additional fire material? One reading is that fire paper was developed before weapons like the boomhammer existed, as a way to add fire to non-fire weapons, and the practice of using it with all weapons, fire or not, persisted because it worked regardless. The hunters did not stop using techniques that worked even when better tools became available. The hunter's torch has one more lore connection worth exploring in this chapter. The torch is not just a weapon but a light source, and light in Bloodborne's world has a symbolic significance beyond its practical use. Darkness in the game is associated with the unknown, with the parts of the world that have been sealed off or forgotten, with the places where the most dangerous things live. A hunter who carries a torch is asserting the value of light, of knowledge, of seeing clearly in places where clarity is uncomfortable. The torch as a weapon is also the torch as a statement. The hunt demands that you look at what you're fighting, that you do not close your eyes and swing. The flame sprayer's role in the powder keg faction is cemented by the description of its creator. The item says it was designed by the powder keg hunters and that the healing church considered them eccentric. The church's judgment of eccentricity is interesting because the flame sprayer is actually one of the more straightforwardly effective weapons against beasts. The church's objection might be less about effectiveness and more about the powder keg's willingness to endanger themselves and their surroundings in pursuit of that effectiveness. A weapon that also risks burning down the city it is protecting is not ideal, even if it kills beasts efficiently. The Boomhammer's old hunter associations raise a question about what changed between the old hunter's approach and the Healing Church's hunter program. The old hunters used fire, improvised explosives, and mechanisms like the stake driver. The church hunters use silver, stone, and arcane weapons. This shift suggests a fundamental change in what the hunt meant, from a pragmatic response to an immediate crisis to an ideological mission with specific tools and specific rules. The Boomhammer is what the hunt looked like before it became a religion. The Kirkhammer is what it looked like after. One detail about the Boomhammer that reflects its lore is its damage distribution. It deals a mix of physical and fire damage on its fire attacks rather than purely fire. This mirrors the nature of the attack. The hammer hits first, physically, and the fire detonates at the moment of contact. The fire damage is secondary to the impact, a bonus inflicted on top of the original strike. This mechanical detail is a simulation of how the weapon actually works, which is unusual in games that often simplify weapon behavior. The Boomhammer's physics are legible in its stat sheet. The fire tradition in Bloodborne's hunting connects to real-world history in a way worth acknowledging. Fire has been used to combat animals perceived as threatening throughout human history, particularly in medieval Europe, during wolf hunts, and in responses to large predator attacks. Fire is effective, dangerous, and carries profound symbolic weight as both a destructive and a purifying force. The hunting tradition of Yharnam's world drew on these real associations when it made fire central to beast hunting, and the weapons of the Boomhammer period represent the peak development of that tradition before the church's more systematic approach superseded it. The stake driver also connects to the real-world tradition of driving stakes through creatures associated with undead mythology. The vampire stake is the most famous version of this tradition, and Bloodborne's Canehurst is explicitly vampire-adjacent. But the stake driver predates the Canehurst connection and appears to have been designed for general beast hunting rather than specifically for vile blood targets. One possible reading is that the stake through the monster tradition was widespread enough in Yharnam's culture that it informed weapon design even outside of explicitly anti-vampire contexts. The progression from the hunter's torch through the Molotov and oil urn to the flame sprayer and Boomhammer is a developmental arc that spans the entire history of the hunt. It begins with a simple fire source and ends with a purpose-built incendiary weapon with a complex mechanism. This arc suggests a hunting tradition that was continuously investing in fire as a tool, getting better at using it over time, and incorporating it into increasingly sophisticated weapon designs. The Boomhammer is the culmination of that development, the point at which fire had been so thoroughly understood and controlled that it could be built directly into a melee weapon without compromising the weapon's primary function. The last detail about the fire weapons worth noting in this chapter is what happened to them after the Healing Church took over the direction of hunting. The Church's weapons do not typically incorporate fire in the same way. The Church pick has fire in its transformed form, but most Church weapons are physical or arcane. The Church seemed to view fire as a useful but limited tool, appropriate for specific situations, but not central to its philosophy. This represents a significant departure from the old hunter's fire-first approach, and it tells you something about how the Church understood the beast plague differently from those who fought it before the church existed. Chapter 9. The Old Hunters, DLC Arsenal, Part 1. The Old Hunters DLC adds a layer to Bloodborne's weapon lore that is qualitatively different from the base game. The DLC's weapons are not simply more powerful versions of existing types. They tell stories about a specific period in the hunt's history, the generation that immediately preceded the game's present, and about the specific people who used them. The Whirligig Saw, Beast Hunter Saif, and Beast Cutter each carry lore that connects them to named characters, specific events, and a period when the hunt was at its most intense and most morally compromised. The Whirligig Saw is the first DLC weapon that most players encounter, and the one that most dramatically illustrates the Old Hunter's approach. The item description calls it the pride of the workshop, and notes that it was used during the Old Hunter's most desperate period, when beast hunting had become less of a disciplined practice and more of a frenzied necessity. The weapon itself is a saw blade that spins at high velocity when transformed, dealing devastating damage to beast flesh in a very short period. It is the most extreme expression of the serrated edge philosophy that began with the saw cleaver. The phrase pride of the workshop in the Whirligig Saw's description is worth examining carefully. The workshop produced many weapons, but this one is singled out as the one the workshop was proudest of. One reading of this pride is that the workshop was proud of the weapon's effectiveness, which was objectively exceptional against beasts. Another reading is more disturbing, that the workshop was proud of a weapon whose extreme violence, whose roaring spinning blade, satisfied something in the hunters who used it that more restrained weapons did not. The pride of the workshop was a weapon that made killing beasts feel like victory rather than necessity. The mechanical design of the Whirligig Saw, a motor-driven spinning blade mounted on a flail-like handle, is a significant piece of engineering for a world that otherwise uses springs and pneumatics. The spinning mechanism requires a power source, and while the game does not specify how this is accomplished, the visual implication is some combination of clockwork spring mechanism and possibly a small amount of arcane energy. The workshop's ability to create a spinning weapon of this kind represents the peak of its engineering capability, and the fact that it used that capability to make something this violent says something about what the workshop had become by the Old Hunters period. The Whirligig Saw's lore also connects to the game's broader theme of the corruption of purpose. The workshop began as an institution that made practical tools for protecting Yharnam. The Whirligig Saw is a weapon that goes well beyond protection, a weapon that was built for destruction and that takes a visible pleasure in destruction through its design. The spinning blade, the roaring motor, the extreme damage output, these are not features of a tool for controlled, disciplined hunting. They are features of a weapon for someone who has started to enjoy the hunt in ways they probably should not. The Beast Hunter Saif is a different kind of weapon from the DLC, smaller and more elegant than the Whirligig Saw, and it tells a different story about the Old Hunters. The item description says it was used by Old Hunters who specialized in beast hunting before the workshop's weapon designs became standardized. The word before is significant. It places the Beast Hunter Saif earlier in the timeline than the saw cleaver and the other workshop staples. This is a pre-standardization weapon, one that reflects a period when hunters were still figuring out what worked. The Beast Hunter Saif's design is a cleaver in its compact form that transforms into a curved, sickle-like configuration with extended range. The cleaver-to-sickle transformation is mechanically similar to certain other weapons, but visually distinct, with a blade that curves away from the wielder rather than toward them, allowing for different attack angles. This unusual design choice suggests that the hunter who originally developed the Beast Hunter Saif was thinking carefully about how beasts move and how to attack them from angles they did not expect. It is an innovative design from a period of innovation. The word Saif in the weapon's name is a real-world reference. A sayaf is a type of Arabian curved sword, and the reference places the beast hunter sayaf in a tradition of bladed weapons that draws from outside Europe's typical armament history. In Bloodborne's world, this suggests either trade connections or a diverse community of hunters who brought different weapon traditions from different places. The old hunters were not a monolith. They came from different backgrounds and brought different weapon philosophies with them, and the beast hunter scythe represents one of those traditions. The beast hunter scythe's lore also speaks to the period of experimentation that preceded the workshop's standardization. The workshop chose certain weapon designs as its standard offerings: the saw cleaver, saw spear, hunter axe, threaded cane, and dropped others. The beast hunter scythe was apparently one of the ones that did not make it into the standard catalogue, perhaps because it required more skill to use effectively than the standardized alternatives, or because its specific advantages did not justify adding it to the regular supply. It survived as a relic of the experimental period, still functional but no longer standard. The beast cutter is the third major Old Hunters DLC weapon in this group, and it is the most explicitly designed for a single purpose. The item description says it was used by Old Hunters who specialized in fighting large beasts, and that its whip-like extended form allowed hunters to attack from a distance greater than most weapons permitted. The serrated edges of the beast cutter, which appear in both forms, reflect the same beast-cutting philosophy as the saw cleaver, but on a different scale. Where the cleaver tears at beast flesh at close range, the beast cutter tears at it from a distance. The beast cutter's transformation from a compact cleaver to a long whip-like weapon is one of the more dramatic shape changes in the DLC. The weapon essentially unfolds, with the handle segments extending and the blade segments connecting into a flexible chain-like configuration. This transformation reveals that the weapon was designed to be collapsed for transport and storage, which says something about the Old Hunter's practical concerns. A hunter who needs to move through crowds or tight spaces and then deploy a long-range weapon in an open confrontation needed a weapon that could do both. The beast cutter was that weapon. The beast cutter's connection to specific characters in the Old Hunters DLC is indirect but present. Several NPC hunters in the DLC are associated with weapons that reflect their specific roles and specializations. The beast cutter's design, clearly made for fighting large beasts at range, fits a hunter who specialized in the kind of large beast encounters that required keeping distance, who had faced enough enormous creatures that they developed a tool specifically for that problem. The weapon is the trace of a character we never fully meet. The beast hunter scythe's skill requirement is notably lower than most weapons of its damage tier, which means it was designed to be accessible to hunters who had not fully developed their strength. One reading of this is that the scythe was an early hunt weapon, made before hunters had the resources or time to develop their physical capabilities fully. The old hunters in the immediate period when the beast plague first emerged were probably not the highly trained fighters that later generations became. They were people who picked up a weapon and went out because no one else would, and the scythe was made for those people. The whirligig saw also has a specific connection to the powder keg hunters that is not made explicit in its description, but can be inferred from its design. The powder kegs favoured extreme weapons with explosive force or continuous damage output. The whirligig saw's spinning mechanism, its continuous damage potential when the blade is in contact with an enemy, and its general overkill quality all fit the powder keg aesthetic. If the powder kegs did not make the whirligig saw, they certainly would have approved of it. The beast cutter's chain-like whip form has a historical connection to real-world weapons that is worth noting. Segmented blade weapons, where a rigid blade can be rearranged into a flexible configuration, exist in several martial traditions, most notably in Chinese swordsmanship. The Qing dynasty's 9-ring broadsword and the chain whip are examples of weapons that blur the boundary between flexible and rigid. The beast cutter places this tradition in the context of Victorian beast hunting, combining the practicality of the reach with the serrated beast-cutting philosophy that the workshop established early in its history. The Beast Hunter Saif's curved form, in its extended configuration, is more than aesthetic. A curved blade, when swung, creates a different cutting motion than a straight blade. It pulls across the target's surface, rather than pushing into it perpendicularly. This pulling motion, which butchers refer to as draw cutting, is more effective for severing than pushing, and against beast flesh with its layered density, draw cutting would logically be more effective than a straight cut. The old hunter who designed the scythe understood blade dynamics in a way that was practically derived from experience with actual beast anatomy. The old hunter's DLC's weapon set as a whole reflects a period when the hunt was chaotic, when solutions were improvised and refined through use rather than designed from scratch with specific parameters. The Whirligig Saw's extreme power, the Beast Hunter Scythe's experimental elegance, and the Beast Cutter's practical ingenuity all reflect hunters who were solving problems in real time. They did not have the luxury of design iterations and workshop testing. They made something, used it, survived, and refined it. The weapons of the old hunters carry that urgency in their design. The Beast Claw is another old hunter's DLC weapon that deserves attention here. The item description says it is a weapon that transforms the wielder's hands into something beast-like, and that using it increases the hunter's rally potential, while also increasing their susceptibility to frenzy. The Beast Claw is the game's most direct expression of the idea that the line between hunter and beast is a line that can be crossed deliberately. A hunter who chooses the Beast Claw is choosing to take on properties of the thing they are supposed to be hunting, which is either an extremely pragmatic approach to combat or an extremely dangerous one. The Beast Claw's connection to the beast blood that corrupts Yharnam's population is direct and intentional. The weapon's increased rally potential reflects how beasts in the game fight. They absorb more of their lost health on hits than hunters normally do, recovering through violence. A hunter using the Beast Claw is adopting this beastly healing mechanism. The trade-off, increased frenzy susceptibility, mirrors the cost of too much contact with the beast blood, the erosion of the self. The Beast Claw is a weapon that works by becoming a little bit of what you fight. The Beast Hunter Scythe's second form, the curved sickle configuration, is interesting because it uses the same attack motions as the standard form, but from a different angle. This means a hunter who has mastered the standard form can transition to the extended form without completely relearning the weapon. The two forms complement each other rather than requiring entirely separate skill sets. This design philosophy of forms that build on each other rather than replace each other reflects a mature understanding of how hunters actually learn and develop their skills in combat. The Whirligig Saw's weapon description uses the word pride in a context that implies retrospect. The workshop is described in past tense in many of the game's item descriptions because by the time the game takes place, the original workshop has been superseded by the Healing Church's more institutionalized approach. The Whirligig Saw, described as the workshop's pride, is thus a relic of an institution that no longer exists in the same form. It is a weapon from a dead tradition, kept alive because it was too effective to abandon. The Beast Cutter's range advantage is its primary differentiator from other weapons in the game, and this range is expressed in the weapon's moveset through attacks that cover unusually wide arcs at unusually long distances. These attacks are specifically effective against the large-scale beasts that the weapon was designed to fight, creatures big enough that getting within normal weapon range was itself the dangerous part of the encounter. The Beast Cutter was made by and for hunters who had learned that lesson. The final detail about the old hunter's first chapter weapons is the relationship between the three of them as a set. The whirligig saw for maximum beast damage at close range, the beast hunter saif for speed and precision, the beast cutter for distance and reach. The three weapons cover the three primary tactical requirements of beast hunting: power, finesse, and safety. The old hunters, working without the workshop's standardized toolkit, had nonetheless arrived at the same basic three-pronged design philosophy. You need a weapon for getting in close and doing maximum damage, one for quick controlled strikes, and one for situations where getting close at all was the problem. Chapter 10. The Old Hunters DLC Arsenal, Part 2. Simon's bowblade is one of the most conceptually unusual weapons in all of Bloodborne. The item description tells us it was wielded by Simon the Harrowed, a hunter encountered in the Old Hunters DLC who approaches his craft from a significantly different angle than most of his contemporaries. Simon's name itself carries weight. Harrowed is an archaic English word meaning deeply troubled or distressed, and also refers to the agricultural process of breaking up soil, of disturbing a surface to allow something new to grow through. Simon the Harrowed is both a deeply troubled man and possibly someone who has broken open the surface of conventional hunting thinking. Simon's bowblade transforms from a short sword into a bow that fires arcane arrows. The concept of a weapon that is both a melee blade and a ranged bow is not new in real-world weapon design. Bow swords and blade bows appear in various historical contexts, but the bowblade's execution in Bloodborne is specific to Simon's character. Simon preferred fighting from a distance, and the description implies this was not cowardice, but a different approach to a shared problem. He saw something that other hunters did not, that hunting beasts at range reduced the risk of the hunter being transformed themselves. The arcane arrows fired by Simon's bowblade are one of the weapon's most lore-significant features. Standard firearms fire bullets, which are physical projectiles. The bowblade fires arrows that carry arcane energy rather than purely physical force. This implies that Simon had developed or acquired knowledge of the arcane in addition to conventional fighting skills, which is unusual for a hunter who otherwise presents as practical and distance-oriented. One reading is that Simon had some contact with the choir or the healing church's arcane research, and the arcane arrows represent that contact translated into his personal fighting style. Simon appears in the Old Hunters DLC as an NPC who offers commentary on the nightmare the player is exploring. He is alive but clearly worn down, and his weapon, when you encounter him in combat later if his questline goes wrong, is used with the experience of a hunter who's been fighting for a very long time in very difficult circumstances. The bowblade in his hands is an extension of his personality, patient, precise, designed to operate effectively while keeping its user as far as possible from the most immediate danger. The amygdalan arm is perhaps the strangest weapon in the DLC, and its strangeness is the point. The item description says it is a severed limb from an amygdala used as a weapon. The amygdala are the enormous spider-like great ones found throughout Yharnam, attached to buildings and hanging from ceilings, visible only to hunters who have enough insight to perceive them. The fact that one of their limbs can be severed and used as a weapon implies two things: that the amygdala are mortal in some sense, or at least physically vulnerable, and that the old hunters who first used this weapon were willing to fight something that most people could not even see. The amygdalan arm deals arcane damage, which makes sense given that it is literally a piece of a Great One. Great One material in Bloodborne's logic is inherently arcane in nature, but the physical weight and reach of the arm also give it significant physical impact, making it a weapon that deals both physical and arcane damage in a combination that reflects its origin. It is not a refined weapon. It is a Great One's body part being used to hit things, which is as raw a weapon concept as the game offers. There is something both powerful and disturbing about a weapon that requires no craftsmanship because its power is simply inherent. The amygdalan arm's transformation is particularly interesting. In base form, it is a limb used as a blunt weapon. In transformed form, it channels arcane energy through itself, creating an eruption of arcane power on certain attacks. This transformation implies that the arm, even severed from its owner, retains some capacity for the arcane expression that the living amygdala would have used. The weapon is not fully dead. It is something in between, a piece of a cosmic entity that is no longer alive, but has not lost its connection to what it was. The church cannon is the DLC's heavy weapon, a firearm of substantially greater power than any standard Bloodborne gun. The item description says it was a weapon of the healing church used in cases where conventional firearms were insufficient, which tells you that the church had developed a conception of escalating force that included weapons of this magnitude. A cannon does not suggest careful, targeted hunting. It suggests hunting situations that had moved past any individual calculation and into territory where large amounts of force were simply the only option. The church cannon fires explosive rounds rather than bullets, and the explosion radius means that accurate targeting is less critical than with standard firearms. This is a weapon for situations where precision has already been abandoned as a requirement, where the target is large enough or the situation is desperate enough that a wide blast radius is preferable to precision. The church, by designing and deploying this weapon, was acknowledging that some hunting situations were not going to be resolved with skill and refinement. Sometimes the church needed to drop a bomb. The lore connection between the church cannon and the healing church's late-stage approach to Yharnam's problems is implied rather than stated. By the time the game takes place, the church is either absent or transformed, its leadership gone or changed beyond recognition. The church cannon, a weapon of last resort, suggests that the church had arrived at its last resort more than once before the game began. The cannon is evidence of previous catastrophes, of situations that required extreme measures, and of a church that was willing to take those measures even at significant cost to its own ideals. Brador is one of the most quietly tragic characters in the DLC, and his connection to specific weapons reveals his story more clearly than his limited dialogue does. Brador is a church assassin, a hunter who served the church by silencing people who knew too much about what the church had done. He is found throughout the DLC as an invading NPC, hunting the player character for reasons that become clear as you piece together his history. His weapon of choice is the Blood Letter, a self-harming weapon that draws on the user's own blood, and the church cannon, which he deploys at range. The Blood Letter is one of the most self-referential weapons in the game. The item description says it was made by Brador and connects it to his specific form of modified beasthood, a controlled transformation that he used in service of the church. The weapon requires the user to drive it through their own hand during transformation, which damages the user but increases the weapon's power. This is an extreme version of the blood sacrifice philosophy that the Chikage embodies. Where the Shikage drains blood over time, the Blood Letter requires an active self-wounding. The weapon is designed for someone who has made peace with their own pain as a resource. The Blood Letter's connection to Brador also raises questions about the church's ethics. The church created and employed a hunter who was willing to wound himself repeatedly in service of his mission, who had incorporated self-harm into his fighting technique. One reading is that the church encouraged or even required this from its assassins, selecting for hunters who had so thoroughly subordinated their self-interest to the church's mission that they would hurt themselves to be more effective. Another reading is that Brador developed the weapon independently, and the church accepted him as he was because he was too useful to refuse. Simon's bowblade also has a secondary lore connection to the broader question of what happens to hunters who grow old. Most hunters in Bloodborne are young. The game's hunting tradition seems to assume a high turnover rate. Hunters die young, or they transform into something that requires their ending, or they lose their mind. Simon is old. He is still hunting. His weapon, designed for distance and endurance rather than close-range power, suggests that he adapted his fighting style to compensate for aging rather than being discarded when his physical prime ended. He is a hunter who survived by thinking rather than just fighting. The Gatling gun is another DLC weapon that tells a story through its design. A Gatling gun in the Victorian period was a cutting-edge military technology, the precursor to the modern machine gun. In Bloodborne's world, a hunting Gatling gun is both an expression of the escalating arms race of the hunt and a comment on what that escalation cost. A Gatling gun is not a tool for precision hunting. It is a tool for overwhelming a target with sheer volume of fire, which reflects a period in the hunt when precision and care had been replaced by desperation. The Gatling gun's weight and its two-handed requirement make it one of the most physically demanding weapons in the game to use effectively. A hunter using it sacrifices almost all mobility for the ability to pour fire into a target at a rate that nothing else in the game matches. This trade-off mobility for damage output is expressed mechanically in a way that has a lore implication. The hunter who chose to use a Gatling gun was a hunter who had decided that running was no longer a viable strategy, who was going to stand their ground and outfire whatever they were fighting. That is either supreme confidence or supreme desperation, and in the old hunter's period, it might have been both. The burial blade's connection to the DLC weapons is worth noting here. The DLC is set in the hunter's nightmare, a separate dimension where the memories and the worst moments of the old hunter's history have been preserved. Many of the weapons in the DLC are weapons from that period, tools of that history. The burial blade exists in the present day of the main game, which means it survived the transition from the old hunter's period to the current one, carrying those memories within it. Gehrman's weapon is the link between the periods, the one constant across all of the changes that hunting has undergone. Simon's bowblade has one more detail worth noting. The bowform's arcane arrows deal a different type of damage than any arrow in a game that does not otherwise have traditional archery. The arcane arrow is Bloodborne's most explicit reference to a form of ranged combat that goes beyond conventional ballistics. Simon invented or found a way to project arcane force through a bow mechanism, which is a combination of physical engineering and arcane knowledge that most hunters would not attempt. It is the weapon of a specific kind of mind, someone who looked at a problem everyone else was solving with close-range tools and decided to solve it differently. The DLC weapons as a set reveal the old hunter's period as a time of remarkable weapon innovation, driven by increasingly desperate circumstances. The Whirligig Saw's extreme violence, the Beast Hunter Saif's experimentation, the Beast Cutter's reach, Simon's bowblade's arcane precision, the Amygdalan Arm's raw cosmic power, and the Church Cannon's overwhelming force all reflect different responses to the same escalating crisis. The old hunters did not have the luxury of choosing a comfortable approach. They made what they needed and used it until it broke, or they did. The final chapter of the old hunter's weapons is the rifle spear and its descendants. The rifle spear's combination of reach and firearm capability established a design pattern that the DLC continues and elaborates. Simon's bowblade takes the reach plus range damage concept in an arcane direction.